Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I was 19 and in the deepest, darkest part of my life, or so it felt at the time. I was living in a small, rundown house with my parents, just barely scraping by. Things with school had fallen apart, I didn't have a job, and it felt like my whole existence was nothing but a series of bad decisions strung together. I felt disconnected from everything and everyone around me, and it was as if I couldn't find a way out of this suffocating place I'd built for myself. My friend, let's call him Matt, was in pretty much the same spot. We'd known each other since high school, and over the last couple of years, we'd drifted into a pretty destructive pattern. We were both stuck in this cycle of trying to numb the pain, trying to escape the overwhelming feeling of hopelessness, and neither of us had a clue how to break free. At the time, I didn't realize how much Matt was struggling, though. I figured he was just another guy going through the motions like me. But looking back, I should have seen the signs. It was about 2 a.m. when I found myself sitting on a cold bench in the neighborhood park with Matt. The park was empty, dark, and quiet, just how we liked it. The streetlights buzzed faintly in the background, casting long shadows on the pavement. I was high, the syrupy taste of DXM still lingering in my throat, and the world around me felt like it was vibrating, swirling in and out of focus. The park, normally a peaceful place, felt off tonight. I wasn't sure if it was the drugs, or if it was just me. Matt leaned back on the bench next to me, his voice low as he spoke, like he was talking to himself rather than to me. "Have you ever just wanted to splatter your brain all over the pavement?" he asked, his tone calm, almost casual. I don't really remember my response. I was too lost in the haze, my mind scattered and blurry. I probably said something along the lines of, "Yeah, but I don't want to hurt my family like that." It didn't even feel real. It was the kind of conversation that just didn't register at the time. At the moment, it seemed like the kind of dark, edgy thing people say when they're high, when everything feels like a bad joke and nothing makes sense. But now, I can't stop replaying it in my mind, wondering if I'd said something different, or if I'd paid more attention to how serious he sounded. Maybe I could have done something. The thought of it makes my stomach twist now, even though at the time, it didn't hit me the way it should have. But there we were, high and numb, as we decided to go grab some computer duster from CVS and get even higher. It wasn't the first time we'd done something like that. We'd both been in and out of strange states of mind before, chasing any kind of numbness to escape the weight of everything. And back then, getting high was just what we did. It was just a part of the routine. The CVS wasn't far, and walking there was always a bit of an adventure in itself. The streets were dead at that time of night, with nothing but the distant hum of cars on the highway and the occasional dog barking from someone's yard. We didn't talk much as we walked, just the occasional joke, or maybe a laugh here and there. We didn't need to talk, though. There was an understanding between us. We didn't have to say much because we were both stuck in the same place, running from the same things. When we got to CVS, it was like everything was happening in slow motion. We slipped inside, kept our heads down, and made our way to the aisle where they kept the canned air. I grabbed a couple of cans, hiding them under my jacket, and we slipped out as quietly as we came in. It wasn't even about the duster at that point. It was just the next thing, the next escape, the next way to push the world further away from us. Back at the park, we found a quiet spot under a tree, away from the streetlights, and we started huffing the duster. At first, it just felt like the world was floating around me, like I was untethered, free. But then things started to go wrong. The edges of my vision blurred, my head felt like it was spinning, and I had trouble keeping my balance. My body felt heavy, like I was being pulled down into the ground. My breath was shallow, and I could barely move, but I didn't care. I was so high that nothing else mattered. Matt wasn't looking much better either. He'd collapsed back against the tree, his eyes glassy and unfocused. I could see that he was struggling to stay conscious, but it didn't feel like it was a big deal. I was so caught up in my own head that I didn't notice how bad he was getting. Eventually, I noticed he wasn't moving, wasn't breathing right. He had passed out. For about 10 seconds, he was completely unresponsive, and in that moment, I realized just how dangerous what we were doing was. But the thought didn't stick. It faded away as quickly as it came. We stayed out there for what felt like hours, the world spinning and pulsing around me, before I finally started to come down. Matt was slowly regaining himself too. When we were both semi-aware again, I decided to leave. I had no reason to stay, no reason to keep hanging around in that park, and I told Matt I was heading back home. I passed by my house on the way out, and for whatever reason, it felt important to say goodbye. "Peace out, Matt," I said, giving him a half-hearted wave. But instead of just the usual laugh or wave back, Matt looked me dead in the eye, his face serious, like he wasn't even the person I knew. His voice, when he said it, was low, heavy with something I couldn't place. "Bye," he said, just like that. No humor, no playfulness, nothing. It was a goodbye, but it wasn't like any I'd ever heard from him before. I walked away, and the further I got, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But the thought passed quickly, and I went home, collapsed into bed, and slept like a rock. A week later, I woke up to my phone ringing, the sound cutting through the fog of sleep. I answered it groggily, still half-dazed from the dreams I'd been having. It was Matt's mom. Her voice was shaking, panicked. "Matt, he's gone." At first, I didn't understand. I thought maybe something had happened to him. Maybe he had gotten into trouble, or maybe he'd overdosed. But no, she told me that he had taken his own life. He'd stood in front of a freight train. The words didn't make sense. It didn't register, not right away. How could he? How could the guy I just saw, the guy I was just with, be gone? I kept thinking about that last moment in the park, the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd said goodbye. It was too late for me to understand. It was too late for me to see the signs for what they were. In the days that followed, I replayed that moment over and over in my mind. I could see his face, hear his voice. I thought about how I could have paid attention, how I could have seen the signs, how maybe, just maybe, if I'd said something different, done something different, I could have stopped it. But I couldn't change it. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't bring him back. And I'll carry that with me forever. I don't know what went through Matt's mind in those last moments. I don't know what he was feeling, what he was thinking when he made that decision. I wish I could have helped him, but I couldn't. I wasn't there when he needed me. I wasn't paying attention to the small signs, the things that didn't seem important at the time, but now scream in my mind every day. Now, every time I think back to that night, to that moment in the park, I wish I had noticed something, anything that could have saved him. But all I can do now is live with the weight of not knowing. Sometimes, when I see the train tracks, or when I hear that phrase, splatter your brain, my stomach twists. It's a reminder of how fragile everything is, how easy it is to slip into a place where you can't see a way out, and how easy it is to miss the signs. I never want to miss a sign again. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it happened when we were still young. My cousin and I had always been the adventurous type, always looking for something exciting to do. Ghost hunting was one of those things we took very seriously, despite not really knowing what we were doing. It was just one of those things kids do when they feel like testing their bravery. We weren't afraid of the dark, or so we liked to think. Armed with fishing nets, as if they were the best tools to capture anything supernatural, we would sneak around the house, trying to be as stealthy as possible, creeping up on something that wasn't really there, or so we thought. It was a typical summer day, the kind where the heat clings to you and every step feels like it's dragging you through thick air. We had just finished a round of bike riding and decided, as usual, to find a new place to explore. We weren't just interested in any old room, though. We'd always heard stories about one particular room upstairs in my aunt's house, the room that always gave off a strange vibe. It was the kind of room that never felt quite right, like there was something lurking just behind the walls, something waiting for you to look away before it revealed itself. Everyone in the family had their suspicions about it, but no one ever talked about it, except for us. It became a sort of challenge between my cousin and me. Who could be braver? Who could last longer in that room? We weren't exactly scared of the dark, but even we had to admit there was something unsettling about the room. There were no lights in there, just the old wooden floors creaking underfoot, and the dim light from the small window that was always shut tight. And yet, when we stood at the door, peering inside, it felt as though something was watching us, as if the room itself was alive. But we had our nets, our trusty weapons, so how could we possibly be afraid? On this particular day, we decided to step up our game. No more sneaking around or poking our heads in quickly. We were going to storm the place like soldiers on a mission. We put on our fishing nets like armor, and I remember how ridiculous we probably looked. But it didn't matter. We were determined. We went to the foot of the stairs, and with a shared look between us, we started the climb. We had done this 100 times before, and this time was going to be no different. Or so we thought. The air was thick and stuffy as we crept up the stairs. The floorboards creaked with every step, a sound we had learned to ignore over time. At the top, we turned down the hallway, the smell of dust and old wood filling our noses. It was quiet, too quiet. It made everything feel heavier, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. My cousin looked at me, and we both nodded, our hearts beating faster now, the excitement building. We had to move quickly. If we hesitated, we knew we'd get cold feet, so we pushed open the door, not really expecting much. But what we saw was something neither of us could have prepared for. We had barely stepped inside when we froze. 4 figures. They weren't like anything we had ever seen before. They stood in the far corner of the room, facing away from us, their pale, almost translucent forms glowing faintly in the dim light. Their features were blurry, like the kind of figures you see when your eyes don't focus right. But there was no mistaking what we saw. They turned slowly to face us, their eyes locked on ours. It wasn't just a casual glance. It was as if they had been waiting for us, like they had been expecting us all along. Time seemed to stretch out in that moment. We just stood there, staring at each other. I could hear my breath in my ears, louder than it should have been. My cousin was standing next to me, just as stunned as I was. We didn't speak. There were no words, just the heavy silence between us and them. The figures didn't move. They didn't do anything. They just stood there, as if caught in time, observing us with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel the weight of their gaze like it was pressing on me, and I didn't know what to do. After what felt like an eternity, but in reality was probably only a few minutes, we snapped out of our trance. The sudden realization hit us both at once. These weren't just shadows or tricks of the light. These were real. They were ghosts. We had stumbled into the middle of something we had never anticipated. It wasn't like the movies or the books we'd read. There were no flashing lights or eerie sounds, just stillness. The kind that makes you feel like you're stuck in a moment that won't ever end. Without thinking, we bolted. We didn't care how loud the footsteps were or how fast we were running. We just had to get out of that room. I remember the sound of my heart pounding in my chest, the cold sweat on my skin, the panic pushing me forward, not stopping until we reached the safety of the hallway. We didn't stop to look back. We didn't dare. We just ran down the stairs, through the living room, and out into the yard. We stood there, panting, staring at the house as if it might chase us. We couldn't speak at first. There were no words. All I could think was, did that really just happen? My cousin was just as quiet, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. Of course, when we told our parents, they didn't believe us. How could they? They probably thought we were just making up stories, trying to scare each other. Ghosts weren't real, not to them. But we knew what we saw. We both knew. We had felt it, seen it with our own eyes, and no amount of adult skepticism was going to change that. As the days passed, the memory lingered in the back of my mind, always there, waiting for me to question it. But I never did. I didn't want to. I knew what we saw, and I didn't need anyone else to tell me otherwise. The thought that we had interrupted something, that we had walked into a conversation we weren't meant to hear, stayed with me. What were they doing? What were they talking about? They hadn't seemed aggressive or malevolent. They hadn't tried to harm us. They had just looked at us. They weren't like the ghosts you hear about in stories. There was no anger, no rage, just quiet curiosity. Over the years, I've thought about that room and those figures many times, but I've never seen them again. Nothing paranormal has happened to me since that day. Maybe I offended them somehow, unknowingly. Maybe they didn't appreciate the interruption. Or maybe, just maybe, they were trying to show us something. Whatever the reason, I never went back to that room. Not for a long time, anyway. But now, as I think back on it, I can't help but feel a strange sense of longing. There was something about that experience that was terrifying, sure, but also oddly comforting. Those figures, they weren't trying to hurt us. They were just there. In that moment, they became part of the story of the house, part of the world we were too young to understand. It was real, and sometimes that's more than enough. I think about it now and wonder what might have happened if we had stayed a little longer, if we had been brave enough to learn more. But that's a question I'll never have an answer to. That room, though, it's still there, just like everything else. A part of the house, a part of the past. And sometimes when I walk past it, I still get that feeling. That heavy, watching feeling. But now it doesn't scare me. It just reminds me of the time we met the ghosts that weren't ghosts, and how, in that moment, I realized that some things are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are more interesting when they remain unsolved. I was just a baby when everything started to change, or so my mother says. It's hard for me to fully understand the gravity of what happened back then, but the way my mom tells it, it feels as though my earliest days were marked by something that went beyond ordinary circumstances, something that was dark and unsettling. My dad had left us when I was only a few months old. I never knew the man, not truly, but I've heard the stories of how he packed up and left without so much as a second glance at his family. He left my mom for another woman, one who, as my mother would later discover, was deeply involved in things that no one should ever dabble in. This woman, from what I've been told, practiced voodoo, black magic, whatever you want to call it, and she didn't just break up a marriage. No, she apparently decided to do something far worse. According to my mom, she placed a curse on me. At the time, my mother didn't know about the curse. All she knew was that something was happening to me, something she couldn't explain. Every night, I would sleep with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, unblinking, unmoving, almost as though I was seeing something she couldn't. It wasn't just an occasional thing. It happened every single night. My mom told me that it was as if I was staring at something dark, something evil. She couldn't understand why, and every night she would sit next to my crib, watching me, waiting for the moment I would snap out of it, but it never came. She would try everything. She'd gently close my eyelids, only for me to open them again moments later, as if I had no control over it. She even thought that maybe I was just an odd sleeper, that babies sometimes do strange things, but it wasn't just that. It felt wrong. My mom said that the air in the room seemed thick, almost suffocating, as though something dark was pressing in on her, even though nothing was physically there. Every night, she would lie awake in bed, heart racing, knowing that something was off, but not understanding exactly what. She tried to talk to my dad about it, but by that time, he was already long gone, living with the woman who had cursed me. And even though she had a growing sense that the curse was the cause of my strange behavior, she didn't have the courage to confront the situation head-on. Instead, she spent her days taking care of me, and her nights lying awake in fear. After about a week of this, she couldn't take it anymore. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. Every day she would wake up and put on a smile for me, but by the end of each day, she would be too tired to function. She had to do something. That's when she decided to visit a local priestess. My mother didn't know much about her, but she had heard whispers about her over the years. She was known in town as someone who could solve problems, no matter how strange, no matter how mysterious. People said that the priestess had powers beyond the understanding of ordinary folk, that she could see things others couldn't, and that she had remedies for all kinds of curses, hexes, and spiritual ailments. In my mom's desperate state, she decided to give it a shot. I wasn't there when my mom went to see the priestess, but from what I've gathered, the priestess didn't speak much at first. She simply listened as my mom explained what had been happening with me. Afterward, the woman told her that the curse had been placed on me and that the only way to break it was through a ritual. She handed my mom a small cloth bag, one that was tied with a thick string. Inside, she said, was a solution, a remedy. The priestess instructed my mom to place the bag over my head while I slept, to say a chant, and then to dispose of the bag in a manner that would break the curse. The bag, she warned, must not be opened under any circumstances. That night, my mom did as the priestess instructed. She placed the bag over my tiny head, and although she was skeptical at first, she recited the chant in a soft voice, just as she had been told. She held her breath as she waited for something to happen. She felt foolish at first, but she also felt a deep sense of hope, as though this could be the answer she had been searching for. After a few moments, she removed the bag, and that's when things took a turn. The bag tore open in her hands, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Inside the bag wasn't just some harmless trinket or symbolic offering. It was something fleshy, something disgusting. She described it as pieces of what seemed like fresh meat, soft and slimy. But that wasn't the worst part. As soon as the bag tore open, the pieces inside turned black, pure black, the kind of black you could never quite escape. It wasn't the kind of darkness that belonged to a shadow. It was the kind of black that felt alive, that seemed to consume everything it touched. My mom said it felt as though the air around her had thickened, as though the entire room was filled with a weight, a heaviness that was unbearable. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that this was the moment when everything changed. She threw the bag away, not caring where it landed, but as soon as she did, something inside her shifted. She described it as a wave of relief, as if she had just gotten rid of a terrible burden that had been weighing on her chest for days. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I slept peacefully. I slept with my eyes closed, like any normal baby should, and my mom said that it was the first time in days she had been able to sleep herself. She wasn't sure what had happened, but she knew that the curse had been lifted. A week later, something else happened that brought everything full circle. My dad came running back to my mom, begging for forgiveness. He said that the woman he had left us for had cheated on him with his own brother. My dad was humiliated, broken, and regretful. I don't know what my mom felt in that moment, but she let him back in. Maybe it was the need for a family, or maybe it was the hope that things would be different this time. Whatever the reason, she forgave him. In the years that followed, my dad tried to make amends for the time he'd spent away from us, but things were never quite the same. The damage had already been done. But as for me, I don't remember any of this, not the curse or the sleepless nights, not the strange rituals or the feeling of something dark hovering over me. All I know is that I grew up in a world that felt mostly normal, though there were moments when I could sense the residue of those early days, when I could feel the tension between my parents and the distant whispers of things that had happened before my memory could form. In the end, I guess I was lucky. Some people go their whole lives never knowing what it's like to be touched by something like that, to be cursed, even if only for a time. My mom never spoke of the curse again after that night, and I grew up with a vague sense of unease whenever she mentioned the past, but it was nothing more than a distant feeling, something I couldn't fully grasp. The curse was broken, and my family, for all the pain it had caused, was finally able to move forward. So much time has passed since then, and now when I look back at the story, it feels like something out of a dream. But I know it wasn't. It was real. The fear, the uncertainty, the strange ritual that lifted a curse, it all happened. And the worst part of it all was that I'll never fully understand why any of it happened to me. But I guess that's life, isn't it? We live with things we don't understand, things that shape us even when we don't know it. Now, years later, when I look back on my childhood, I remember it mostly as a time of quiet, normal days. Days that were filled with the usual ups and downs, but nothing like what my mom had gone through during those early months. The curse may have been broken, but its shadow, however faint, lingered in my family's history, a reminder of something dark that could never quite be erased. I was in China this past summer with my parents. They were in the middle of a government meeting, and I was left with some downtime between shopping trips. Instead of just sitting around bored, I decided to take a little stroll through the Chengdu Panda Park. My tour guide was a young, athletic woman in her 20s. She was energetic and friendly, chatting with me as we made our way into the park. I didn't expect much, just some downtime surrounded by a bunch of pandas. But something happened that day that I'll never forget. Something strange, something off. The Chengdu Panda Park is huge. It's not like a regular zoo. It's designed more like a city zoo, but with a singular focus: pandas. There were countless enclosures, research areas, and of course a lot of tourists. I had been walking around for a while, trying to spot pandas. We were talking, but mostly I was just enjoying the slow pace and the cool air under the big trees. The place was pretty crowded, but after a while the people thinned out a bit. As we were strolling through one of the less populated parts of the park, we turned a corner, and that's when I first noticed the guy. He stood out, even in the crowd. He was tall, older than me, maybe in his 50s, wearing a beige trench coat, even though it was an absurdly hot summer day in China. The heat was oppressive, and I was already sweating through my shirt. Most people were wearing summer clothes, but this man had on a full trench coat, like something straight out of a noir detective movie, something like Columbo would wear. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was weird, sure, but the sun was brutal, so maybe he was just trying to shield himself from it. As we moved on, I saw him again, standing near one of the panda enclosures. He was just standing there, not really doing anything. He had his back turned toward us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. I'd caught a glimpse of his face earlier, and there was something unsettling about the way his eyes seemed to follow me. Not just looking at me, but watching me. Like he was studying me, sizing me up, trying to figure out something. I kept walking with the guide, trying to shake off the unease I felt in my chest. But it was like I couldn't stop glancing back at him. It was strange. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe the heat was getting to me. But there was something wrong about him. I watched as he raised his umbrella again, shielding himself from the sunlight as he moved toward a stretch of path where very few people were. We were heading that way too, so I just tried to ignore him. We arrived at a spot where the pandas were more active. The area was a little more isolated, deserted, even. This was where things started to get even stranger. I was enjoying the sight of the pandas playing around, tumbling over each other, when I noticed the man again. This time, he was standing at the end of the narrow path, under the shade of a tree, holding his black umbrella open above his head. Now, at first, it didn't seem that weird. People use umbrellas all the time in China to shield themselves from the sun. It's common, especially on hot days like this. But the more I watched him, the stranger he became. The guy wasn't moving, wasn't doing anything at all. He just stood there, staring at us. And then it hit me. He was staring at me. Not at the pandas, not at the trees, but at me. It was like a cold weight settled on my chest. The more I looked at him, the more my unease grew. It wasn't just the fact that he was watching me. It was the way he was doing it. There was something wrong about his expression. Something predatory. I couldn't really explain it, but it felt wrong. Like he was studying me the way someone might study prey. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a shiver running down my spine. I glanced at my guide, but she didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. She was chatting about the pandas, pointing out a few of them to me, but I couldn't focus on what she was saying. All I could do was watch this man in the trench coat, standing at the end of the path with his umbrella unmoving. Time seemed to slow down. Every time I glanced at him, I felt more and more uneasy. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just some weird tourist who happened to be in the same place as us. But it didn't feel like nothing. Then, as if it couldn't get any worse, I saw it. He opened the umbrella again. Not to shield himself from the sun, though. It was already late in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the trees. No, he opened it like it was some kind of signal. A slow, deliberate motion. Something in my gut told me to stay alert. I could see his face better now. The man was staring at me with a look that made my skin crawl. His eyes were wide, not with curiosity, but with something darker. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't just the expression. It was the way he looked, too intent, too focused. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting for something. I snapped my attention away from him, trying to focus on the pandas. But all I could think about was the man. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something bad was about to happen. We kept walking, moving further along the path toward the exit. The man didn't move. He stayed in the same spot. But I noticed something. He was still holding that black umbrella up. And every time we passed an area with sunlight, he would open and close it again, as though adjusting it to keep himself covered. But there was something unsettling in the way he did it. Each time, his eyes followed us, and I swear I saw a small, tight smile curl at the edges of his mouth. I kept trying to ignore him, but the feeling in my chest was getting heavier. It wasn't just an odd man in a trench coat anymore. This guy was fixated on us, on me specifically, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Something bad was about to happen. As we walked toward the exit, I glanced over my shoulder again. The man was still there. His umbrella was now fully open, casting a long shadow over the ground. But as I looked at him, he did something that made my blood run cold. He nodded at me. It was small, just a slight tilt of his head, but it felt deliberate, like he knew something I didn't. And then, in the dimming light of the park, he smiled at me. It wasn't a normal smile. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't even human. It was jagged, like a predator's smile. His teeth were sharp, almost too sharp, glinting in the fading sunlight. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. The smile didn't fade. It stayed there, hanging in the air, like a sick joke. My guide was ahead of me, walking toward the exit, unaware of the terror that had gripped me. I quickly turned and caught up with her, not daring to look back again. We left the park in silence. But that smile, those teeth, have haunted me ever since. I didn't tell my guide, didn't mention it to my parents. I couldn't. They wouldn't believe me. But every time I think about it, The image of that man, standing under his black umbrella, with that creepy, jagged smile, comes rushing back. I don't know who he was, or why he was there. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that day. But I know one thing for sure. That man wasn't just some strange tourist. He wasn't just trying to shield himself from the sun. He was something else. Something unnatural. Growing up, I was always a bit of a mama's boy. My parents had divorced when I was young, and for whatever reason, I felt a stronger connection to my mom. I guess it was because she was the one who took care of me day in and day out. She was always there, and I guess I just felt like I had to protect her in a way. Maybe it was because I knew she worked hard to make sure we had everything we needed. She worked the night shift at a nursing home, and I would often worry about her driving so late at night. The job was about 35 or 40 minutes away, and with the hours she worked, I couldn't help but think about how dangerous it might be, especially driving through isolated, dark roads in the middle of the night. When I was a kid, I used to lie in bed after she kissed me goodnight, and my mind would wander to worst-case scenarios. What if she got into a car accident on the way home? What if she didn't make it back? I would imagine these things as I lay in the quiet of my room, staring up at the ceiling. I was so fixated on it that it started to feel real. I could see her driving, the headlights of her car cutting through the darkness, and I'd hear the crunch of gravel under her tires. But there was something else there too, a feeling of unease, like something was just a little bit off. But she would always come home, and the worries would fade, only to return the next night. I never told her how much I worried about her driving. I didn't want her to feel bad about it. I just kept my fears to myself, replaying them in my head over and over again. Every night, without fail, I would think about her on the road, and it was like I had no control over it. It became routine in my mind. She would leave for work, and I would sit there, staring out the window, wondering if everything was okay. Then, a few months ago, I had a dream. It was one of those vivid dreams that felt too real, almost like I wasn't even dreaming at all. I don't usually remember my dreams, but this one stayed with me, clear as day. It started with me in the passenger seat of a car, but I wasn't driving. It was like I was observing, not actually inside the scene. I could feel the cold air coming through the open window. The street was dark, and the only light came from the car's headlights cutting through the fog. I recognized the street. It was one my mom had driven on countless times. I had seen her drive down it, and I always thought it looked so lonely, like the kind of road that should have no one on it. I could see her car in front of me, and I knew it was her driving. I could almost feel her hands on the steering wheel, gripping it tightly. Her eyes were focused ahead, but she looked tired. I could tell she was probably thinking about the long day ahead of her, the residents she'd be caring for, the late hours. She was always so selfless, and I admired that about her. I could hear the hum of the engine, the occasional soft shuffle of her movements, but there was an odd stillness to the air, like something wasn't quite right. As she drove, I noticed a car pulled over to the side of the road. Its headlights were flickering, and smoke was coming from the hood. The car was one of those older models, the kind that always seemed to break down at the most inconvenient times. I could see the figure of a man standing near the front of the car. His silhouette was hard to make out, but I could tell he wasn't moving much. He seemed almost stuck in place, like he was waiting for something. Without thinking, my mom slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, just past the car. I felt my stomach drop. I knew what was coming. She was going to stop, wasn't she? She always did this, helping people in need, even if they seemed strange or out of place. It was in her nature. She never turned away anyone who needed help. The man walked over to the passenger side of the car, and I could see the faintest flicker of his face in the headlights. He had a rough, weathered look to him, like he'd been through some hard times. He had an army green beanie pulled down low on his head, and his jacket matched the color. He looked like a normal guy, or at least as normal as anyone could look at that hour in the middle of nowhere. But something about the way he moved made me feel uneasy. He wasn't in a rush, but he wasn't hesitant either. I watched as he opened the passenger door, and my mom just nodded, still focused on the road. Without saying a word, he slid into the seat beside her, placing a small backpack in his lap. The air inside the car felt even heavier now, and I could almost hear my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why, but I wanted to scream, tell her to drive away, to not let this man into the car. But I couldn't do anything. I was stuck in this place, helpless. The man gave her a quick, silent nod of thanks, and my mom just gave him a small, polite smile before turning her gaze back to the road. She didn't seem to notice the strange feeling that had settled over the car. She just kept driving, her hands steady on the wheel. The man, however, seemed to relax once he was in the car. He pulled something out of his bag, and I could hear the soft rustle of fabric as he rummaged through it. I watched, frozen, as he took something out, something metallic. It looked like a drill, but it wasn't any regular drill. It had a long, thin, razor-sharp edge, gleaming under the faint light of the car's interior. My stomach churned as I watched him hold it in his hand, turning it over like it was just another tool, completely nonchalant. I could feel my pulse quicken, but my mom didn't seem to notice. She was still focused on the road, still oblivious to the danger sitting right beside her. I don't know how, but I could feel the tension building. It was like I could see what was coming before it even happened. It was like watching a movie where you know something terrible is going to happen, but you can't stop it. I saw the man's eyes flicker towards her, and even though he was calm on the outside, there was something unsettling in his gaze. He was holding that drill like it was nothing, like it was just a tool, like he didn't even care that he was sitting in a car with a woman who had no idea what he was capable of. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What was he planning to do? Was he just going to sit there, or was something much worse coming? I wanted to scream at my mom, to tell her to look, to turn around, to drive away. But the dream didn't give me that chance. It was like I wasn't really there. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't save her. And then, just as quickly as it started, everything cut to black. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room around me was dark, but I could feel the weight of the dream pressing on me. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, of helplessness. I couldn't stop thinking about that man with the drill, about the way he casually held it, about how my mom had no idea what was happening right next to her. I didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. I kept tossing and turning, replaying the dream in my mind over and over again, each time more vivid than the last. What would have happened if the dream hadn't cut to black? What would he have done? Would my mom have noticed? Would I have been able to stop it? The next morning, I called my mom and told her I loved her, something I hadn't done in a while. I didn't tell her about the dream. I didn't want to scare her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been trying to tell me something. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a warning. That night, when she left for work, I stayed up a little longer than usual, sitting by the window and watching the road. I couldn't explain why, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I just watched as the darkness enveloped everything, hoping that I would see her headlights coming down the road. When I finally did, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. She was home, safe. But even now, every time she drives to work, I still think back to that dream, and I wonder if that man is still out there, waiting for someone to stop and give him a ride. I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a dream, and I pray that it was. It was late summer in a small town near Calgary, just about 11 o'clock at night. The kind of night where the sky is dark but not completely black, the last traces of sunlight just barely hanging on at the edge of the horizon. The air was warm, a little sticky from the day's heat, and there wasn't much noise, just the hum of distant traffic, the occasional dog barking, and the chirp of crickets. I was out with my friend Jake. We'd decided to explore a patch of undeveloped land on the outskirts of town, a place we'd heard about but never been to. It wasn't far from the neighborhood, but it felt like another world, one we could escape into for a little while. We weren't worried about anything bad happening. We were both the kind of guys who liked to push the limits, but always had our guard up. We had to get past a barbed wire fence to get to the area. It wasn't a big deal. We'd done this kind of thing before. The fence had a small section where the wire wasn't as tight, so you could slip through if you were careful. We'd practiced our moves before, timing it so that neither of us would get caught on the wire. On the other side of the fence, the land opened up. It was mostly dirt and tall grass, an old construction site or something like that, with mounds of dirt scattered about. Nothing was built, though. Just this barren land stretching out in front of us. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting shadows that made everything feel like it was just a little bit off, like you weren't quite sure what you were looking at. We made our way up a large dirt hill in the middle of the land. The dirt was loose underfoot, and we had to be careful not to slip. Once we reached the top, we could see the town in the distance, but it felt far away. The lights from the houses looked small, flickering like distant stars. The only sounds now were the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft scrape of our shoes in the dirt. We were standing there for a moment, taking it all in, when we saw something. At first, I wasn't sure if it was just our eyes playing tricks on us in the dim light, but then it became clearer. Down below, a little to the right of where we were standing, there was a collection of tents. Not a lot, but enough to stand out in the open like that. They were big, old-looking tents, like the kind you might see at a homeless camp, but these were too neat, too organized. There were no fires, no signs of people moving around, just the tents sitting there, like they'd been put up and forgotten. We didn't move. We just stayed there, lying flat on the hill, trying to be as quiet as possible. I remember feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a mix of excitement and that uneasy feeling you get when you realize something might be wrong, but you're not sure yet. It was almost as if the land itself had shifted, and something was about to happen. We stayed still for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes, just watching. We couldn't make out much detail from where we were, but we saw shadows moving inside the tents. It wasn't like people walking around. It was more like someone stirring in their sleep, adjusting themselves in the middle of the night. It made me uneasy, like they were aware we were there, even though we were still too far to see any faces or hear anything clearly. Then, someone emerged from one of the tents. At first, it was just a shape, a dark figure stumbling out into the moonlight. The guy was tall and lanky, dressed in what looked like ragged clothes, a faded flannel shirt and loose pants. He had a wild ginger beard that looked like it hadn't been shaved in months. He didn't notice us right away, and I think we both held our breath, hoping we hadn't been seen. I'll never forget the next part. He walked a few steps, and then just stopped. I figured he was adjusting himself or doing something, but then it hit me what he was doing. The guy unzipped his pants and started to piss, right there in front of the tents. We couldn't believe it. It wasn't like he just stepped off to the side to be discreet. He was completely casual about it, standing in the open with no care in the world. Jake and I exchanged a quick, terrified look. My heart was pounding. I could feel the sweat on my palms, and my mind raced. If this guy saw us, we were dead meat. There was no telling what kind of people these were, or why they were out here in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. We had to stay still and wait. Then, just as we were about to crawl back down the hill and make our way back to the fence, something else happened. The quiet was broken by the sound of an engine. We froze, not knowing what to expect, and then we saw it, a motorized golf cart. It came into view at the base of the hill, moving slowly across the dirt like it was searching for something. The headlights cut through the dark, and the bright beam of a spotlight scanned the area in front of it. I could see the two people sitting in the cart, both dressed in dark clothes, their faces hidden in the shadow of the cart's roof. I don't know how long we lay there, flat on our stomachs, trying not to make a sound. We shifted our bodies just enough to stay out of the light, our hearts thumping in our chests. The cart passed right by the bottom of the hill, the spotlight sweeping back and forth like it was looking for someone or something. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some random camping spot. These people were out here for a reason, and we had no idea what that reason was. When the cart finally passed, Jake and I didn't wait. We didn't even say anything to each other. We just started moving, fast, running down the hill. Our feet slid in the loose dirt, and we had to catch ourselves a few times to keep from falling. We made it back to the barbed wire fence, and as we were about to slip through the gap we'd used earlier, we heard it, a shout. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The voice was rough, like it had just been dragged through the dirt. It wasn't far off, and it was loud. I could hear the heavy footfalls of someone running toward us. My heart slammed into my throat, and I felt the adrenaline hit like a wave. There was no time to think. We had to go. I dove through the hole in the fence, and Jake followed right behind me. We didn't look back, didn't even slow down as we ran full speed through the dark, our feet pounding against the ground. The whole world was a blur, just the sound of our breathing and the pounding of our hearts in our ears. We ran all the way back to his house, barely stopping for breath, too afraid to even talk. When we finally reached his front door, we slammed it shut behind us and locked it. We stood there for a few seconds, trying to catch our breath, and then the panic hit us. We had no idea who those people were, what they were doing out there, or how close we'd come to being caught. There was no way to explain what had just happened. It felt like it had been a dream, but the rush of fear in my chest told me it was all too real. We never went back to that place. It was like the whole area had been changed for us, like we could never look at it the same way again. The memory stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. We were lucky that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if we'd stayed any longer, things might have turned out a lot differently. Even now, when I drive past that stretch of undeveloped land, I can't help but glance over. The place looks just as empty as it did before, but I know better now. There's something out there, something that waits for you in the dark, and I'm not sure I ever want to find out what it is. It was one of those nights where everything felt just a little off. I was about 15 years old at the time, a little too old for the night terrors, or at least I thought. But my room, all the way at the end of the hallway, faced the street, and it had always given me the creeps. The windows were old, letting in sounds from outside, and the streetlights threw these long shadows against my walls. Most nights I'd lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I was already used to the sense of unease that settled over me in the quiet hours of the night. What I wasn't used to, though, was the way the dark seemed to move in the corners of my room, the way it seemed alive. I had a cat, and she was always my comfort. A calico named Hazel. She had this way of showing up at just the right moment, curling up next to me in bed, or rubbing against the window to be let in when I was starting to feel too restless. She knew my routine better than I did. Every night she'd wander outside, usually coming back in the same window, every night except this one. It wasn't even that late, maybe 10 or 11 p.m. on a weekend. My parents were still up, and I had no reason to be nervous, but for some reason, I was. I had been in my room for a while, scrolling through my phone, but there was this pressure building in my chest, this feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just the quiet, or maybe it was just my mind being paranoid. But whatever it was, it had me on edge. When I realized Hazel hadn't come to the window yet, I started calling for her softly, then louder when she didn't respond. "Here, kitty, kitty," I murmured, stepping toward the window, half hoping I'd hear her meow from outside. Nothing. I stood by the window for a few minutes, pressing my face against the screen, looking out into the dark. The night was still, nothing moved. The trees in the yard swayed a little in the breeze, but there were no sounds of animals, no distant cars. Just the hum of the streetlights. I told myself she was fine. Cats do that sometimes, wander a little too far and get caught up in something. But the longer I stood there, the more restless I became. Finally, I made up my mind to go outside and find her. Maybe she was under the porch or hiding in the backyard. I grabbed my hoodie, pulled on my shoes, and stepped outside, the cool air hitting me in the face as I closed the door behind me. The grass was damp, and I could smell the earth, the faint scent of wet leaves. I walked toward the yard, calling her name, shaking the treat bag to make noise in case she was near. "Here, kitty, kitty." I called again, louder this time, hoping she'd come running from behind the bushes. I walked around the yard for a minute, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach only grew. Something about that night made everything seem off. It was like the world was holding its breath. I called her again, but it didn't feel right. I glanced back at the house, the dim glow of the porch light casting long shadows in the yard. Nothing moved. I stood there for a second, trying to decide whether I should just give up and go back inside, or keep looking. I turned to head back, thinking maybe she'd come in through the window by the time I got back. And then it happened. I didn't even hear him approach. One moment, I was walking toward the front door, and the next, I turned around to find a man standing less than 2 feet behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. He wasn't particularly tall, but he had this unsettling presence, like he was too close, too solid in a space where I had no reason to expect anyone. He was old, his face weathered with age, and his clothes were dark, too dark for the streetlights to catch much detail, but enough for me to see the outline of a long coat. His eyes were narrow, focused on me in a way that felt almost predatory, and his expression was neutral, like he was just waiting for something. I don't know how long we stood there, but I couldn't move. It was as if the air had thickened, and every inch of my body screamed to run, but my legs were frozen. The silence between us felt like it lasted forever, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. His face didn't change, and neither did mine, but I could feel the tension between us. The knot in my stomach tightened. I didn't want to look at him, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. Finally, I snapped out of it. I don't know how, but I suddenly realized that I had to get away. I turned, not too quickly but not slow either, and walked back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look behind me. I didn't want to know if he followed me or if he was still standing there, but I didn't run. I just walked fast, trying to keep my breathing even. I stepped back inside and shut the door quietly, leaning against it for a second as I tried to process what had just happened. The house felt suddenly too small, like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't tell my parents right away. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to freak them out. Maybe I thought I was overreacting, or maybe I just didn't want to believe what had just happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was out of place. I sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the door, my mind racing. A few minutes later, I stood up and walked into the kitchen, my dad sitting at the table reading the paper. I told him, almost casually, about the man standing behind me in the yard. He didn't seem that concerned at first, but after a few seconds, he looked up from the paper and his face changed. Without saying much, he got up, grabbed his jacket, and went outside. I stayed inside, too nervous to follow. I could hear him stomping around the yard, calling out into the darkness, but there was no response. No man, no sound, nothing. After a few minutes, he came back in, his face hard but not angry, just concerned. "He's gone," he said simply. No sign of anyone. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up in my room, feeling every shadow that moved outside the window, every creak of the house settling. Hazel never came back in that night. I never heard her at the window scratching to be let in. I just lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The whole time, I kept thinking about that man. The next day, I told myself it was probably nothing, that it was just some old guy wandering around. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he was drunk. But it didn't sit right with me. We lived in a tiny town. A town where everyone knew everyone, and I had never seen that man before. And even if he was just some old drunk, why was he so close to my house, standing just behind me, without a word? I tried to brush it off, but as the years went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more had been at play that night. Why had he been there? And why had he been so close? We never found out who he was, or what he wanted. And after that, I couldn't help but wonder if he had been waiting for the right moment, or if he was just some random, harmless old man. But every time I think about it now, the question gnaws at me. What would have happened if I hadn't turned around just then? What would have happened if I had been a little slower, or if I hadn't turned around at all? I never saw him again. Never heard a thing about him from anyone in the town, which is even more unsettling. A strange old man, standing so close behind me, and no one ever came forward to say they had seen him. The town was small enough that if anyone had known him, they would have said something. But no one did. He was a ghost in the flesh, just passing through, and I'm glad I never saw him again. I learned that night not to ignore that uneasy feeling in the pit of your stomach, and not to take things for granted. There are people out there who can stand in your yard, just behind you, and disappear as quickly as they come. And sometimes the scariest part isn't the thing you see, it's the thing you never do. I was in high school, probably around 16 or 17 years old, when I volunteered at a local church's daycare. It wasn't a regular gig, but it wasn't unusual either. I had a close friend who was involved in church activities, and one evening, they were short on hands to help out during their evening service. It was getting late, around 7:30 or 8 p.m., and the kids were all there, playing in the daycare center while their parents attended the service and dinner afterward. The daycare itself was small, with 2 rooms that connected through a single door. One room was for snacks, a small kitchenette with a few tables and chairs where the kids could sit, eat their crackers, or drink juice. The other room was the playroom, with toys scattered all over the floor, and that's where the kids liked to go once they finished their snacks. I volunteered to stay in the snack room, while my friend went into the playroom to keep an eye on the other kids. I was told to just clean up after the snack time, make sure no one left anything behind, and then I could join the others. I didn't mind. I liked helping out, and it wasn't too hard of a job. The kids were all pretty well behaved, and it was just a simple task. There was one little girl, about 3 or 4 years old, who didn't want to go into the playroom with the rest of the kids. She said she wanted to stay with me, so I handed her an extra cracker to keep her entertained while I cleaned. I wasn't too worried about her. She was calm enough, and I figured she'd be fine. She started talking to herself, which wasn't anything unusual. Kids that age often do that. I remember thinking it was cute how she babbled about whatever came to her mind. I don't know how much time passed, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I was wiping down the tables, making sure to pick up the little crumbs and stray wrappers left behind. But suddenly, I heard the girl start to cry. Not a whimper, but full-on, hysterical crying. It startled me, and I spun around, thinking maybe she'd hurt herself or choked on something. I could see her sitting there, her face red, tears streaming down her cheeks. Cracker crumbs were all over her lap, and she looked like she was about to make a mess of herself. I rushed over to her, concerned, and gently lifted her up into my arms. I checked her mouth, thinking she'd bitten her tongue or something, but there was no blood or injury. Her tongue was fine. Still crying, she clung to me, and I softly asked, "Are you okay? What's wrong?" Between sobs, she mumbled something that was hard to understand, and I had to lean in closer to hear her properly. I could see her little chest heaving with each cry. "That boy won't stop picking on me," she said, barely able to get the words out. I paused, confused. "What boy?" I asked, still holding her gently. I looked around the snack room. No one else was in there. The playroom was empty of anyone who could be picking on her. It was just the two of us in the room. She pointed to the far corner of the room, her finger trembling as she did so. "That dead boy over there," she cried, and the way she said it, it sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. What the hell? There was no boy in that corner, let alone one that could be dead. It was just an empty, shadowed spot in the room, with no one there. But she was so insistent, and her face was twisted with fear, her tears making her look even smaller, more vulnerable. I don't know why I didn't immediately think to laugh it off, or just brush it aside. Maybe it was the way she looked, so genuinely frightened. Maybe it was the sheer intensity of her emotion. But at that moment, something inside me clicked, and I decided it was time to get her out of that room. I didn't want to stay in that room any longer, especially after she'd pointed to that empty corner and referred to something so bizarre. I gently picked her up, still hugging her, and said, "Let's go to the playroom, okay?" She sniffled but nodded against my shoulder, still trembling. I carried her out of the snack room, trying to make sure my steps were steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My heart was racing, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, anything, that could explain what had just happened. As soon as we entered the playroom, I handed the girl over to my friend. She immediately took her in her arms, asking her what was wrong, but the girl just clung to her and stopped crying. I stepped back, feeling an uneasy chill that was almost too hard to explain. My mind kept replaying what had happened in that snack room, the girl's tear-streaked face, and her eerie declaration. A dead boy. The thought wouldn't leave me. I stood there, frozen for a second, trying to make sense of it all. But I wasn't about to hang around and investigate. I didn't care to figure out what she'd meant by dead boy. My stomach churned, and all I wanted was to escape that daycare room. I turned to leave the playroom, but something made me hesitate. I wasn't about to go back into the snack room, but I had a strange compulsion to look back at the hallway that led to it. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, or rather, the absence of something. There was just a dark spot at the end of the hallway, but when I blinked, it was gone. I walked outside, away from the building, and sat on the steps to the daycare entrance. The air was cool, and the night had fully set in. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, still trying to calm myself down. What had I just experienced? Was it just the girl's imagination running wild, or had something truly unsettled her? I spent the rest of the night keeping my distance from the daycare. I hung out in the church lobby, pacing, trying to distract myself. Every time I thought about the little girl's tear-streaked face, my stomach turned. I couldn't shake the image of her pointing to that empty corner and saying what she did. The phrase "dead boy" echoed in my head over and over. When the parents came to pick up their kids later that night, I made sure to stay out of sight. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone about what had happened. I just wanted to forget about it, to pretend like it never occurred. But for a long time afterward, I couldn't forget it. Even though the memory faded with time, there was something unsettling about it that stuck with me. I kept imagining that corner in the snack room, and I couldn't help but wonder, what if that little girl had seen something I hadn't? What if she wasn't just imagining things? Maybe there was something I didn't understand, something unexplainable, that only she could sense. I never went back to volunteer again. I didn't want to. That night had creeped me out more than I could admit, and I wasn't interested in trying to make sense of something that felt far beyond what I was ready to understand. Maybe it was just a scared little girl making up stories in the dark, or maybe there was something more to it. But one thing was for sure, I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. Some things, I figured, were better left alone. It was our first year at college, and I remember walking into the dorm with all the excitement that comes with new beginnings, new friends, new experiences, and a sense of independence. At first, everything was fine. My roommates and I got along. Our dorm was pretty much what you'd expect. Nothing fancy, just a small, cramped space with old furniture and shared bathrooms down the hall. We settled in quickly, getting used to the strange mix of personalities that lived in the building. Most of the people on our floor were a little odd, but we quickly adjusted. But there was one guy, and I don't know how to describe him other than unsettling. He lived a few floors above us, on the top level of the building. His name was Kyle, though I don't think anyone ever really knew his last name. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, but he had this way of showing up unannounced, like he had some radar for when people were in the halls or having a good time. The first time I remember seeing him was on one of those rare nights when we were actually being loud. It wasn't anything malicious, just a group of us laughing and talking, having a few beers, nothing out of the ordinary. But apparently it was too much for Kyle, who walked into our room without knocking, his eyes wide, kind of glazed over. He was lanky, a little too thin, and always seemed to be wearing this heavy hoodie, even when it was warm. I noticed right away that there was something off about him. His face didn't match his voice. When he spoke, it sounded almost rehearsed, like he was trying too hard to sound normal. But that first night, he just smiled and asked if he could hang out with us. At first, we were all kind of taken aback, but he didn't seem threatening, so we let him stay. He didn't talk much, just listened, which was fine with us. Honestly, we didn't think too much about it. But then, he started showing up more and more, asking to hang out whenever he saw us. At first, it was just in passing, but then he started coming to our room on purpose. We didn't really mind, but there was something about him that made us uncomfortable, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. One thing we did start doing around that time was smoking weed. It was something we'd just gotten into, and it seemed harmless enough at the time. But the more Kyle hung around, the more we realized how badly he reacted when he was high. At first, he just seemed to zone out, staring at the walls like he was lost in thought. But soon, he started getting more erratic. His behavior was weird even when he wasn't high, but when he was on something, it felt like he was in another world. It made all of us uneasy, but we didn't really know how to tell him to leave without being confrontational. So we started avoiding him. We didn't exactly shut him out, but we would pretend we weren't home when he knocked on our door, or we'd make up excuses not to hang out with him. I thought that would work, but Kyle wasn't stupid. He noticed. One night, when we were all sitting in the room, trying to figure out how to tell him to leave us alone, Kyle appeared in our doorway. No knock, just walked right in. His expression was blank, his eyes wide and kind of glassy, like he had been staring at something for too long. He didn't say hello. Instead, he just stared at us, his lips curling into this twisted grin. My roommates and I exchanged glances, each of us nervous, but trying to act casual. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Kyle said, his voice strangely calm. "You've been avoiding me." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, and it sent a chill down my spine. We all kind of froze. I didn't know what to say. I could see my roommate, Sarah, trying to come up with something, anything to make him leave, but she was just as caught off guard as the rest of us. Kyle walked further into the room without being invited. "You think I don't know what you're doing? It's fine, you know. I get it. You don't want me here. I'm different." He said the word different, like it didn't just describe his quirks, but like it defined him. As if being different wasn't just an observation. It was something deeper, something that separated him from the rest of us. I could feel the tension in the room. We were all just staring at him now, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as casually as he'd entered, Kyle dropped this bombshell. "Yeah, I'm a sadist. If I ever killed someone, I'd torture them first." The words hit us like a punch to the gut. I swear, I felt my stomach twist. The room went dead silent. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if he was joking, but there was nothing in his voice, nothing in his eyes that said it was a joke. It was like he was proud of it. He wasn't bragging, not exactly, but he was letting us know who he was. and the way he said it made me feel like he was daring us to respond. I don't think any of us knew what to do. We just stared at him, the words echoing in my mind like a warning bell. Finally, someone, I think it was Mark, muttered something about being tired and suggested we call it a night. Carl didn't seem to mind. He turned on his heel and left just as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving behind that unsettling smile and the feeling that we had just narrowly avoided something awful. The next day, we reported it to our RA, though we knew it was a long shot. The guy never did anything that technically broke the rules. He didn't threaten us physically, not exactly. It was more of a vibe, a feeling, like we were in the presence of someone who could snap at any moment. But the RA just shrugged it off, said there was nothing to worry about. I don't know if he didn't believe us, or if he just didn't want to get involved, but either way, it made us feel even more helpless. To make matters worse, the weather had been unbearably hot. My roommates didn't like to close the door at night, hoping for a breeze, so we left it open with just the screen keeping the outside world at bay. That meant that for the next few nights, we had no privacy. I couldn't sleep well, not with Kyle's weird words hanging in the air. Every noise I heard outside, every shadow in the corner of my eye, made me wonder if he was out there, just watching. And then one day, Kyle just disappeared. No warning, no explanation. One day, he was there, and the next, he wasn't. No one saw him leave. His room was empty, and he didn't show up for class. It was like he vanished overnight. We asked around, but nobody had any answers. Even his few friends in the building seemed to have no idea where he went. Some people speculated that he'd been kicked out, or that he'd transferred, but the truth is, nobody really knew. The odd part was that in the weeks after he was gone, it felt like a weight had been lifted off the entire floor. It was like the air was lighter, easier to breathe. But even so, there was this lingering feeling that something wasn't right. The fact that Kyle had disappeared without a trace, no goodbye, no explanation, left a mark on all of us. I don't know what happened to him. I sometimes wonder if he ever came back to the school, or if he found a new place to hide. Part of me is still afraid that one day, I'll run into him again and he'll remember me, or worse, he won't remember me at all, but I'll remember him. And maybe that's the scariest part of it all. Kyle's still out there, somewhere, and I don't think any of us will ever forget that smile. That smile that still haunts me whenever I'm alone in the dark. When I was little, I used to cry a lot, especially at night. It wasn't just the usual bad dreams that kids have. It was more like a constant, suffocating dread that would settle in me as soon as the sun began to set. My parents would do their best to comfort me, but nothing worked. Eventually, they gave up trying to console me altogether. They would simply wait in the hallway outside my bedroom door, quietly listening until my crying would die down, until I eventually cried myself to sleep. I was a sensitive kid, and the nightmares seemed endless, even more so because I could never fully explain what I had seen in the dark. There is one memory from those nights that still sticks with me. Even now, decades later, I can still picture it in vivid detail. It was the middle of one of those crying fits, when I was struggling to catch my breath between sobs, and I was still wide awake, fighting off sleep, when I saw them. Two small figures appeared at the edge of my vision, just near the foot of my bed, where the shadows danced on the walls. I thought they were part of the darkness, at first, just my mind playing tricks as I was consumed by fear. But no, they were real enough to make my heart pound in my chest. These things, whatever they were, had the most unnerving red eyes like glowing embers, and they were laughing, high-pitched, childlike giggles that sent chills down my spine. What made it worse was how they moved. They weren't walking or crawling. No, these two little goblin-like creatures seemed to be floating in the air, twisting and spinning in midair, as though they were swinging from invisible circus bars. I remember how they kept laughing as they did somersault after somersault, their tiny bodies flipping through the dark like acrobats in some twisted show that no one had invited me to. They seemed to enjoy it too much, like it was some sort of game to them. The sound of their laughter grew louder with each flip, each spin, and I felt like the walls of my room were closing in on me, suffocating me with fear. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, and I could barely force any sound out. I could only cry harder, louder, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear me and make them go away. But no one came. They kept swinging and laughing, and I felt like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare that wouldn't end. No matter how much I cried, no matter how much I screamed inside my head, Those little goblins just kept swinging and laughing, their red eyes locked on me. The sound of their laughter echoed in my ears, growing more and more distorted, until it was all I could hear. I had never been so terrified in my life. It was like my entire world had been turned upside down, and I was trapped in a place where no one could help me. Eventually, as I lay there frozen, paralyzed by fear, the goblins disappeared, vanishing into the shadows as though they had never been there at all. But that image of them, those red eyes, their mocking laughter, their twisted little somersaults, never left me. It was like they had branded themselves onto my mind, a permanent scar I couldn't erase. Even after I finally cried myself to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in my room with me, something that shouldn't have been there, something that had watched me while I was at my most vulnerable. That was when it started, the unease that lingered in the air when I was alone. I couldn't look at the shadows in my room the same way anymore. They felt wrong, like something could step out of them at any moment. I stopped wanting to sleep, stopped wanting to be in my room at night. But eventually, the crying fits stopped. I grew older, the nightmares became less frequent, and I learned to shut my mind off before I fell asleep, pushing the memories of those goblins into the back of my mind. Fast forward to my freshman year of high school, and things seemed pretty normal. I was just an average teenager, dealing with the usual pressures of school and growing up. But then, it started again. Not the nightmares, not the crying, but something else. Something that I couldn't explain. I remember the first time it happened. It was a quiet night, one of those nights where the house felt too still, too empty. I had just gotten out of the shower and was walking back to my room when I glanced up at the balcony that overlooked the living room. It was a clear view into the space where the grand piano sat, gleaming in the low light from the hallway. That was when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, maybe a shadow or the reflection of something outside. But no, this was different. There, standing by the balcony railing, was a figure in a dress. She was staring down at me, her head slightly lowered, her long hair hanging in front of her face, obscuring most of it. But I could still see her eyes. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and intense, locked on me as if she had been waiting there for a long time. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. I wanted to run, to hide, but my legs wouldn't respond. I stood there, staring at her, as she just kept looking down at me, silent and unmoving. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to escape, but I was paralyzed. I must have been standing there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few seconds. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, and I bolted upstairs, slamming my bedroom door behind me and locking it. I was terrified. I couldn't explain what I had just seen. I knew it wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. It was real. But that night wasn't the only time. Over the course of my freshman and sophomore years, it became a regular occurrence. Every few nights, I would see her again. Every time, she was standing in the same spot, staring down at me with that same unsettling, silent gaze. Her head would always be slightly tilted down, but her eyes were always visible, watching me from above. Sometimes, I would try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe I was just overtired, imagining things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. At first, I would panic. I'd run upstairs and lock myself in my room, hiding under the covers until I felt safe again. But after a while, I became desensitized to her. I started just staring back at her when I saw her, waiting for the moment when she would disappear. It was always the same. I would look up, see her there, and for about 6 to 10 seconds, she would remain perfectly still, not moving an inch. Then she would vanish, fading into the shadows like she had never been there at all. I never told anyone about it, not my friends, not my parents. It seemed too crazy to share, too strange to be real. But it was real enough to me. The more I saw her, the more I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if I was imagining things. But no matter how many times I saw her, the fear never went away. Each time, it was like the first time. Each time, I felt the same cold dread seep into my bones, the same feeling that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, I moved out for college, and the figure stopped appearing. It was like she had disappeared as suddenly as she had come. I don't know if I ever truly understood what I had seen, or what it meant. It's been years now, and I still don't have any answers. But there's one thing I know for sure. Whatever I saw, it was real. Real enough to scare the hell out of me. Real enough to leave a mark on me. And even now, as I think about those long, quiet nights in that old house, I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was always watching. The first time I stayed at Claire's house, I wasn't sure what to expect. She'd just moved in a couple of weeks earlier, and I hadn't been to her new place yet. When I walked in, the air was thick with the smell of fresh paint and cardboard boxes stacked in the hallway. The house was huge, old too. Something about the way the floors creaked under our feet made the place feel like it had a story to tell, a history I didn't know. Claire's parents had told me that the house had once belonged to an old man who passed away there, falling down the stairs. They said the house had been empty for a while before they moved in, and it felt like it still carried the weight of that time. I didn't think much of it at the time, though. I mean, it was just a story. Who wouldn't feel a little nervous living in a house like that, right? But as the night wore on, things started to feel off. We were just hanging out, playing video games in the living room. Claire had a couple of friends over too, and we were all laughing, eating chips, and drinking soda. It felt like a typical sleepover. But as we walked through the house, I started noticing little things that didn't quite make sense. The first weird thing happened while I was in the bathroom. I had just finished washing my hands, and as I turned to leave, I felt a cold gust of air rush past me, right in front of the bathroom door. It was like someone had opened a window, but the windows were all shut. I checked the door, thinking maybe there was a draft coming from under it, but there was nothing. It was so cold, though, that I felt a chill run down my spine. When I came back into the living room, I didn't say anything to Claire about it. I didn't want to sound weird, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room itself felt colder, too. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from air conditioning or a draft, but the kind that sinks into your bones. Later on, Claire and I were heading up to her bedroom to get ready for bed. The stairs creaked beneath us, and I felt like I was being watched. It was an uncomfortable sensation, one I couldn't explain. The moment we stepped onto the second floor, the feeling hit me even harder. It felt like there was something in the air, something that didn't belong. Her bedroom was just as odd as the rest of the house. The furniture was all wicker, and the windows were covered with thick, old curtains. Her bed was massive, and there was this strange feeling of emptiness in the corners of the room. Not the kind of emptiness that comes from a lack of stuff, but the kind that feels too quiet, like the space is holding its breath. We got settled on the bed, pulling the blankets up to our chins. Claire's cat, a fluffy gray tabby named Misty, jumped onto the bed and curled up between us. I felt her little body snuggle against my side, and I relaxed a bit. It was easy to forget about the weirdness of the house when you were wrapped up in the warmth of the blankets, listening to the soft hum of the house settling around us. But then things started happening. Little things at first, barely noticeable. The bathroom door slammed shut in the distance. Claire and I both turned toward the noise. It sounded like it had come from the downstairs bathroom. We both looked at each other, and I could see the same unease in her eyes. There was no way the door could have slammed on its own. It wasn't a draft. The door had been latched tight when I left. Still, we didn't say anything. We were both pretending it hadn't happened. We laughed it off, trying to focus on something else, but my mind kept going back to that door slamming. Then we heard it again. The wicker furniture in the corner of the room started to shake. It was a soft rattling sound at first. Then it grew louder, the perfume and makeup bottles on the dresser vibrating. I felt my heart start to race. Claire looked at me, and I could see her face drain of color. Neither of us moved. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded but couldn't find the words to respond. We sat there in silence for a while, too scared to speak. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Then, something else happened. It was subtle, but it was there. A soft pressure on my back, like a light push, urging me down the stairs. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if something invisible was guiding me, pushing me in the direction I needed to go. I felt Claire tense beside me, as though she was feeling the same thing. "Let's just go to bed," I said, my voice shaky. I couldn't help it. I was scared, but I didn't want to show it. Claire nodded in agreement, and we climbed under the covers, trying to ignore the strange noises that seemed to come from all around us. We lay there in silence for a long time, facing away from each other. The house was quiet now, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, alone in this vast, empty house. Then I felt it. The bed shifted. It wasn't a creak from the old frame. It was something heavier, like something had sat down between us. I froze. Claire must have felt it too because I heard her breathing change. It was like we both instinctively knew what was happening, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. I reached out to pet Misty, thinking she had jumped onto the bed to cuddle with us, but there was nothing there. The bed was still, and the indentation where something had sat was gone. "Did you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy trying to make sense of what had just happened. We both turned over, sitting up on the bed. I could see the dim light from the street lamp outside creeping in through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor. We were both too scared to move, too scared to speak. The house was still, deadly still. Finally, Claire reached for her phone, the screen lighting up in the dark. She dialed her mom's number, her hand shaking. I could hear her voice tremble as she spoke softly into the phone. "Mom, can you come upstairs? We heard something. Something weird. I don't know, just please come up." Her mom's voice came through the phone, sounding calm but concerned. Claire hung up the phone and turned back to me. "She's coming up in a minute," she said, her voice barely a whisper. We sat there in the darkness, waiting. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting too. When Claire's mom finally came up, we explained everything to her. She listened carefully, nodding slowly, but didn't seem all that worried. She told us it was probably just the house settling. Old houses made all sorts of weird noises. She smiled reassuringly at us and said we should try to get some sleep, that it was nothing to be scared of. But I wasn't so sure. The feeling that something was in the room with us, that it was watching us, didn't go away. It lingered in the corners of the room, in the creaks of the floorboards, in the shadows that seemed to stretch too far. I could still feel the pressure on my back, urging me to move, to leave. That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. The faint groan of the old wood, the whispers of the wind outside, the occasional thud from downstairs. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just the house, I knew there was something else there. Something that didn't belong. I didn't stay the night at Claire's again for a while. When I did, it wasn't the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, waiting for something. And every time I visited after that, the strange things continued to happen. The gusts of cold air, the rattling furniture, the slamming doors. But the worst part was always that feeling, the feeling of being pushed, of being told to leave. In the end, I didn't have to come up with any kind of explanation for it. I just knew that whatever had happened in that house, it was still there. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't some fairy tale story. It was just something real. Something that had been left behind. Something that had been part of the house long before we ever stepped foot inside. And no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, it never truly went away. I never thought much about what it takes to become a firefighter. It seemed like a job that always required bravery and strength. And while I had seen the sirens wail and the flashing lights on our street countless times, I didn't understand the weight of the moments those lights signaled until it happened to my brother. At the time, he was only 16, just starting his training, his first few weeks being more about observation than real action. I knew he wanted to be a firefighter, even though it sounded so intense to me. I didn't know how he could want to face danger head-on every day, but I respected it. He wasn't like me. He had that drive in him, the courage to see things most people wouldn't want to even imagine. He didn't talk much about his training, but he did tell me once that they started slow with the rookies. It was all about reality checks. They wanted you to know, from the start, what you were getting into. And on this day, my brother would get his reality check. I don't think he was ever prepared for what he would see. It started just after 5 o'clock, around sunset, when the team got the call. The light was starting to fade, casting long shadows on the ground, the kind of light that feels eerie, like the world is half asleep. It wasn't a huge emergency at first. No fire, no disaster, just a simple accident. Or at least, that's what it should have been. I remember him telling me about it later. He said that when they pulled up to the scene, there was an eerie quiet hanging in the air, the kind that precedes something horrible. The usual chaos of people running around, shouting for help, wasn't there. It was like everyone had frozen. The call had come in from a local church. Apparently, some kids had been playing outside, kicking a ball around in the yard. The ball had gotten stuck in a tree, and one of the men who was there, probably just trying to help, had decided to climb up and get it down for them. He hadn't thought it would be a big deal, something small and insignificant. But what happened next would haunt my brother for the rest of his life. The man fell, and it wasn't a simple fall. It wasn't like someone tripping and stumbling over their feet. No, he came down hard. My brother didn't go into details, but I could tell from his face when he talked about it that the impact was unlike anything he'd ever imagined. He landed headfirst. The way he described it, it was like the world had slowed down. The man's body contorted in unnatural angles as he crashed to the ground. The force of it, it was just wrong. That kind of fall isn't something you ever forget. But the worst part came after that. When they reached the man, when they got close enough to see him clearly, my brother was hit by something he wasn't prepared for. The man's face was the first thing my brother noticed. He said it was the kind of thing you can never unsee. The face was bloody dark blue, like someone had drained all the color out of it. His skin was stretched tight across his skull, and his eyes were wide open, but they were unseeing. The entire left side of his face was shattered, contorted from the fall. It was so bad, my brother didn't even know how to react at first. He said it felt like time had stopped. But what really made it worse, what really cemented the image into my brother's mind, was the man's neck. It was broken, completely broken. It didn't even sit right. The bones had shifted and twisted unnaturally, leaving it dangling, just slightly moving with the shallow breaths the man was taking. The way his neck wobbled as he breathed, the soft gurgling noises, the small bubbles of foam that collected at his lips, it was something straight out of a nightmare. The man's body was fighting to stay alive, but the brain couldn't keep up. The man's life was hanging by a thread. My brother said it was like watching someone's life slip away in slow motion. He could hear the man's labored breathing, a mix of gurgles and gasps. There was nothing he could do. He was just standing there frozen, watching someone die right in front of him. It wasn't like in the movies, where someone miraculously pulls through at the last second. It wasn't like the training where they talk about saving lives, about being the one who can make a difference. In that moment, my brother realized just how powerless he was. And it hit him hard. He was a rookie, barely out of high school, and this was his first real scene. A man had just died, and no one could do anything to stop it. The whole situation was surreal. The ambulance came, but it was too late. They tried their best, but the man's injuries were beyond saving. It didn't take long before the paramedics called it. My brother told me they stood there for what felt like forever after that, in complete silence. The other firefighters, the ones who had been through the tough calls before, didn't say much either. They were still in shock, just like my brother. He said it felt like they were all waiting for something. Like maybe the man would sit up or something, like a miracle would happen. But it never did. I could tell that night was the first time my brother had really come face to face with the fact that the job wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the sirens and the high fives. It wasn't just saving people. Sometimes, it's about standing there while someone dies in front of you, knowing there's nothing you can do. It's about realizing how fragile life is. And it's about seeing things that can't be unseen. After that, things changed for my brother. He started questioning whether he was cut out for this job. He was shaken. I could tell he was trying to process it all, trying to figure out how to live with that image, with that moment, for the rest of his life. It took him a while before he could even talk about it. And even then, when he did, his voice was different. It wasn't that same confidence he had when he first joined the department. It was quieter, more reflective. He had seen the darker side of the job, the side that doesn't get talked about much. But as the weeks went on, something shifted in him. He didn't quit, even though I thought he might. He didn't back down. Instead, he kept going. He threw himself into his training, harder than before. He learned to push through the moments when everything felt too overwhelming. He learned how to compartmentalize, how to focus on the job at hand, and not let the weight of the world crush him. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he'd come home, tired and distant, his eyes a little too empty. But he kept going. He kept moving forward. I think he understood then what it meant to be a firefighter. Not just the physical strength it takes, but the mental toughness too. It's about enduring the worst moments, the moments that make you question everything, and still showing up the next day ready to face whatever comes next. I don't think my brother will ever forget that man's face. I don't think any of the first responders who were there that day will ever forget it. But what I've come to understand is that sometimes it's the things we witness, the things that shake us to our core, that define who we are. And even though it was one of the hardest moments of his life, I think it made my brother a better firefighter and a stronger person. I've always found the concept of intuition to be a little strange. You know, that gut feeling that tells you something's wrong, or even something that doesn't quite make sense. For the longest time, I thought it was just coincidence or my overactive imagination. But after that day in the bakery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something far beyond my understanding had occurred. And to this day, I still can't explain it. It all started when my mom decided to open a wholesale bakery. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. My mom had always loved baking, and the demand for homemade pastries had been growing in our area. She'd been talking about it for years, and when the chance to set up shop in a family friend's home came up, we jumped at it. The space she was offered was in the in-laws' quarters of this family friend's house. The house was large and somewhat old, and the in-laws' quarters were tucked in the back, behind a row of overgrown rose bushes. It wasn't the most glamorous space, but it was perfect for starting out. The house itself belonged to a man named Ben, a quiet, reserved guy who had lived there for as long as I could remember. Ben was a few years older than my parents, and we'd always heard stories about how much he'd taken care of his mother, who had lived with him for the last 20 years. Ben's mom was an elderly woman named Anka, originally from Serbia. I'd met her a few times when I was younger. She was frail, but had a sharp look in her eye, as if she was always studying her surroundings. It didn't take long before I realized that the relationship between Ben and Anka had been a bit unusual. He'd taken care of her to an extreme extent, doing everything for her, even after she had passed the point of being able to care for herself. From what I understood, it had been this way for years. And when she passed away, just a few months before my mom moved in, Ben was devastated. He didn't talk about it much, but it was clear that he was still struggling with her death. I didn't know much about the deeper details of his grief, and I certainly didn't know about the things he'd been holding on to. I didn't know about the hoarding either. It wasn't something that ever came up in casual conversation. For the first few days, the bakery was bustling. My mom had a good rhythm going, making batches of cookies, pastries, and bread. I helped out in the mornings before school, kneading dough and arranging trays. Ben was always around, though, hovering in the background, not really interacting with us directly, but always there. It was strange, almost like he was trying to be invisible, but couldn't help but watch us. Then, one afternoon, something happened that I can't forget, no matter how much I try to brush it off. I was in the bakery by myself, preparing a fresh batch of dough for the next day's orders. The kitchen was warm, the air filled with the smell of yeast and butter, a scent I'd grown accustomed to over the past week. I remember that it was quiet, almost too quiet, and I was absorbed in the process, kneading the dough with practiced hands. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, I felt this overwhelming sense of unease. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like something was pressing on my chest, something in the air that wasn't quite right. I froze for a moment, my hands still on the dough, trying to figure out what it was. My first thought was that maybe Ben was lurking around again, as he often did, but when I looked over my shoulder, he wasn't there. Then it hit me. I saw her. It wasn't like I actually saw her standing in the doorway or anywhere in the bakery, but I could see her in my mind, this woman, yelling at me in a frantic mix of Serbian, Russian, and English. Her face was contorted with anger, demanding to know where Ben was. She kept repeating the question, louder and louder, until it felt like the walls of the bakery were closing in around me. At first, I thought I was imagining things, that maybe I was just exhausted from working so much. But the more I tried to focus on what I was doing, the more the image of this woman filled my mind. Her words were jumbled, almost incoherent, but they were unmistakable. She was looking for Ben, asking why he hadn't gotten rid of the dresses, why he hadn't moved on, why he was still holding on to everything. I didn't understand. I didn't know what she was talking about. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just stress or a fleeting moment of weirdness. But the image of her wouldn't go away. Everywhere I went in that bakery, she followed. In my peripheral vision, I'd see her, her face distorted with frustration, still yelling at me, demanding that I tell her where Ben was. Her words mixed together in that strange, urgent language, and the more I heard it, the more frantic she became. And then it hit me. She was angry because of the dresses. But what dresses? I had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't even know Ben had anything of hers left in the house. I thought he'd cleared out her things after her passing. But there she was, screaming at me to tell him to get rid of the dresses. Her voice was sharp, echoing in my head, so real it almost felt like she was right there with me. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the bakery, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I needed air. I needed to calm down. I ran to the front yard of the house, trying to clear my head, but I could still hear her voice in my ears, repeating the same questions, demanding the same answers. I stood there, frozen, and after what felt like hours, the sound finally stopped. It was like the air cleared, and everything was still again. I didn't know what to think, what had just happened. Was I hallucinating? Had I just gone crazy? I didn't know. When Ben finally returned, I was sitting on the porch, my hands shaking. I was still trying to process what had just occurred, trying to make sense of the images that had filled my mind. I didn't want to tell him. It seemed insane, like something straight out of a nightmare. But as he sat down next to me, he looked at me with a strange, knowing expression. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain what I had just experienced? I didn't even understand it myself. So I just nodded, not trusting my voice. And then, as if reading my mind, Ben spoke again. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze. My stomach dropped. He didn't seem surprised at all. I didn't know," I stammered. "Who was she?" Ben looked at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he sighed, and there was a sadness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "That was my mother," he said softly. "I think she's still trying to make me let go." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to react to that. I wasn't even sure I believed in what had just happened. But there was something about the way he said it that made me believe him. Then, Ben reached into his bag and pulled out a photo, one I'd never seen before. He showed it to me, and I gasped. There she was, the woman I'd seen in my mind. Her face was the same, her clothes, too, the same dress I had seen her wearing. I hadn't recognized it before, but now it was clear. "That's her," Ben said quietly. "That was the last outfit she wore before she died. She had this thing about keeping everything. She never let go of anything. And I couldn't either. I couldn't let go of her things, of her clothes. I still didn't know what to think. The image of her, screaming at me, demanding answers, was still vivid in my mind. But I couldn't deny that what Ben had said made sense. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't supernatural. It was grief. It was the way someone could be so tied to the past, to the things they couldn't bring themselves to let go of. I didn't know what had caused the image to appear so vividly in my mind, but I think in a strange way, it was her, Anka, trying to reach out, trying to tell Ben what he needed to hear. Maybe it wasn't even meant for me at all. Maybe I was just the messenger. In the end, Ben decided to go through the clothes, the dresses, the things his mother had hoarded. It wasn't easy, but he did it. He cleared out the rooms, piece by piece, and slowly began to move on. I still don't know what happened that day in the bakery, but I learned something I didn't expect. Sometimes, people hold on to the past in ways that are harder to understand than we can imagine. And sometimes, it takes something unexpected, like a flood of memories or a strange, urgent feeling, to make us realize that letting go is the only way to heal. A year has passed since that day, and I still don't fully understand what happened. But I do know that whatever it was, it helped Ben start to move forward. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. I've never been someone who's scared of the usual things, ghosts, monsters, the dark. But this night, when I was 11 or 12, I remember it being one of those moments when everything felt a little off. It wasn't so much the fear of something lurking in the dark, but a sort of odd unease that I couldn't explain. And if you've ever had one of those nights, when the usual things don't feel quite right, you know what I mean. It was summer, the kind of weather where the air is warm, but not hot, and you can just open a window and let the cool breeze in. I had spent most of the evening in my room, reading. My summer routine usually involved a stack of books from the library, mysteries, adventure stories, fantasy. It was one of the things I looked forward to most, getting lost in the pages until the light outside faded to black, and I could barely keep my eyes open. That night, I had picked up Dracula, the classic. I didn't really know much about it, except that it was one of those books that had always been mentioned when people talked about horror stories. I thought I'd give it a try, intrigued by the old-school vampire theme. I settled into my bed, the soft light of my lamp casting a yellow glow on the walls. The rain had started to fall lightly outside, the sound of it against the window creating a peaceful, almost comforting atmosphere. It wasn't enough to be bothersome, just a steady pattering. My room had a box fan in the window, but I didn't need it on tonight. The air felt just right, cool but not cold. I started reading, but after a while, I noticed the rustling sound outside the window. It was faint at first, the kind of noise that might be explained away by the wind or something small brushing up against the screen. But as I continued reading, I heard it again. The sound was closer this time, and it was unmistakable. Something was moving near the top of the window. It was soft, almost hesitant, like whatever it was wasn't quite sure whether it should be there. I glanced up, annoyed at the interruption, but froze when I saw what was causing it. At first, it didn't make sense to me. It was an animal, brown in color, but I couldn't immediately place what kind of animal it was. It was crawling near the top of the window frame, making its way between the glass panes. The box fan was right beneath it, the fan that I hadn't turned on because of the cool air. I stared at the creature, trying to process it, but it didn't register at first. It took a few long moments for my brain to catch up with what I was seeing. It was a bat. I had never seen a bat up close before, but I recognized it now. Its wings were folded in, and it seemed to be struggling slightly, trying to find its way in or out of the narrow space between the window. My heart began to race as I watched it, the sharp contrast of its dark, leathery body against the dim light of my room. I wasn't scared, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I don't know why, but it felt wrong, out of place. I had always been more of a let-it-be kind of kid, but this was different. It didn't belong there. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring at it. The bat didn't seem to notice me. It continued its slow, erratic movements, bumping against the glass, trying to find a way through. I wasn't sure what I should do. I had never dealt with something like this before. Should I scream for help? Should I try to shoo it away myself? I didn't know. I glanced down at my bed, and there was my book, open to a page I had barely read. Dracula. The irony hit me then. I was reading about vampires, and now here I was, with a bat in my room. The thought almost made me laugh, but it was too unsettling to find humor in it. Something about it just didn't sit right. I stood up quietly, trying not to make any noise. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like any sudden movement might make the situation worse. I tiptoed toward the top of the stairs, my bare feet making almost no sound on the wood floor. My dad's office light was still on downstairs, so I knew he was up. I called softly, not wanting to make too much noise. "Dad." He didn't answer right away, so I called again, a little louder. "Dad." He appeared at the bottom of the stairs a few moments later, his tired eyes squinting up at me. "What is it?" "There's a bat in my room," I said weakly, feeling ridiculous saying it aloud, but the urgency in my voice was clear. I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced at first, but he nodded and started heading up the stairs without another word. I led him into my room, and he immediately walked over to the window. The bat was still there, wedged between the two panes of glass, not moving much anymore. It seemed exhausted, as if it had been struggling for a while. I could see my dad's expression change slightly, like he wasn't sure what to make of the situation either. I wasn't sure what he was thinking, but I could tell he was trying to figure out what to do without panicking. He grabbed a piece of wood that was sitting by the fan and gently tried to nudge the bat into a position where it might crawl up or down. It didn't work. The bat didn't respond, just remained still, seemingly trapped. My dad kept trying, shifting the piece of wood, trying to coax the bat into moving, but it didn't budge. After what felt like an eternity, my dad got frustrated. He took the piece of wood and with one sharp movement, jabbed it toward the bat. There was a sharp shriek, and for a split second, I thought it was going to break free, but instead it fell silent. The room was too quiet for a moment, and I felt my stomach churn. My dad moved quickly, cleaning up the bat and getting rid of it in a way I didn't want to ask about. The whole thing felt surreal. I didn't know if it was my imagination running wild, or if the situation was really as strange as it seemed. But after my dad left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stayed awake for a while, listening to the faint sound of rain against the window and trying to convince myself it was just a fluke, a bat, nothing more. The next morning, I woke up feeling tired, like I hadn't really slept. I tried to shake off the weirdness of the night before, but my mind kept going back to that bat. Why had it chosen that night to come into my room? Why had it happened while I was reading Dracula? It was such a strange coincidence that I couldn't help but dwell on it. At breakfast, I told my mom and dad about what had happened. My dad wasn't as shaken as I was, but he repeated the same thing he had said the night before. He thought I had been imagining things or dreaming, especially since the book was on the floor by the bed. I understood where he was coming from. It did seem like an odd coincidence. After all, what were the odds of me starting a book about vampires the same night a bat just happened to show up? It made me feel a little crazy, like maybe I had imagined it, or maybe I had fallen asleep with the book open and dreamed the whole thing. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't feel like a coincidence at all. It was too strange, too surreal. I couldn't explain it, but something about the whole thing felt like a warning. Like something was trying to tell me that life sometimes gives you signs in the strangest ways. And sometimes they show up when you least expect them. I never looked at bats the same way again after that night. I was never particularly scared of them, but I couldn't help but think of that bat every time I saw one. The way it moved, the way it crawled in through my window, its strange stillness after my dad had jabbed it with the piece of wood. It all felt like a sign, like something was watching, something waiting. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was the coincidence of starting a vampire novel the same night a bat decided to make my room its home. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night I met that bat would always stick with me. And every time I picked up Dracula again, I would remember that odd moment when life mimicked fiction in the strangest of ways. I was in the living room, cradling my newborn in my arms, the soft hum of the baby monitor by my side as I tried to settle her into a comfortable position for nursing. The quiet of the house felt nice, peaceful even. It had been a long day of managing feedings and diaper changes, so this brief moment of calm was something I was savoring. My partner was out of town for work, which meant it was just me and the dogs, but I was used to it by now. Still, being alone in the house with a newborn made me a bit more aware of the noises around me. From upstairs, I suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of our dogs running around. I had two, but one of them, Tank, was a big Rottweiler. His heavy footsteps always made the floorboards creak in that familiar, almost rhythmic way, and this noise was definitely Tank running around. I couldn't tell at first what exactly was going on, but it sounded like they were chasing each other. The house was quiet aside from that, and the noise echoed through the walls, making it clear that they were up there in the master bedroom. The thing was, our dogs were usually only this loud when they were playing with something, either a pair of my panties or one of the baby's toys. Tank was the one who would normally get all riled up when he grabbed something, and the other dog, Chloe, would chase after him to try to get it. It was cute, but also incredibly annoying when they did it late at night. So I let out a sharp, annoyed, "Hey, knock it off up there, come downstairs." I didn't want to deal with this, not when I was already trying to nurse my baby and get her to settle. For a moment, the sound seemed to fade, but then it picked up again. There were more thumps, more creaks, as though they were running from one end of the room to the other. I could tell it wasn't just creaking from the old floorboards. This was clearly the sound of the dogs running around, their nails clicking against the hardwood. I gritted my teeth, aggravated now. I said, "Come downstairs and knock it off." I shouted louder this time. The noise continued for a few moments, and then it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed felt almost eerie, and I paused, holding my breath for a moment. And then I heard something else. It wasn't the sound of a dog running around. It wasn't the sound of movement at all. It was the sound of Tank stretching, his big body groaning as he shifted from where he'd been lying down. I could hear his paws hitting the floor, followed by the soft shuffle of him walking across the living room, coming closer and closer to where I was sitting. The sound of his nails on the wood was unmistakable, and I knew it was him. But there was something wrong with it. My heart started to race as I looked around the room. Tank was coming from behind the other couch, where he always slept, but Chloe wasn't there with him. She was at the groomer's, which meant there was only one dog in the house, Tank. But the noise I had heard, the thumping, the running, it hadn't been him. I knew it couldn't have been. It had sounded like two dogs, not one. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, but it wasn't working. I couldn't ignore the tight feeling in my chest, the way my hands were trembling as I continued nursing my baby, hoping to calm myself. I had been alone in the house countless times before with the dogs, and nothing had ever happened like this. But now it felt different. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. A few months earlier, I'd had a similar experience, and now that I was thinking about it, I couldn't help but wonder if it was somehow connected. My friend had been staying over while my partner was out of town, and she'd been sleeping downstairs with the dog beside her. The next morning, She asked me why I was walking around upstairs in the middle of the night. I told her I hadn't been, that it was probably the dog moving around. But I wasn't sure why I had said that, why I had assumed it was Tank. In reality, I hadn't been upstairs at all that night. The whole thing didn't sit right with me, especially since Tank had been sleeping soundly beside me just like he always did. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an odd coincidence. But now, as I sat there with the memory of that conversation fresh in my mind, I wasn't so sure anymore. Tank padded over to where I was sitting and lay down beside me, his large body settling onto the couch with a deep sigh. I looked down at him, the rhythmic sound of his breathing calming me slightly. The baby was still latched on, her little hands grasping at the fabric of my shirt, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the sounds I had heard coming from upstairs, the thumping, the chasing. It had been too clear, too real to ignore. I glanced up at the ceiling, my eyes flicking to the stairs that led up to the master bedroom. It was silent now, too silent. There were no more sounds of movement, no more running around. Just the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of Tank's breathing beside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was missing something, something important. But what? The house was old, sure, but it wasn't falling apart. The floorboards creaked, yes, but they didn't do that on their own, not unless something or someone was moving around upstairs. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just the dogs being their usual misbehaving selves. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the fact that Tank had been the only one downstairs with me, and Chloe wasn't even there to make any noise. So why had it sounded like two dogs running around? Why hadn't Tank made a sound when I had yelled at the dogs earlier? But now, when everything went quiet, he was suddenly up and moving around. I sat there, holding my baby, feeling more and more on edge. My thoughts started to spiral, the quiet moments becoming heavier, more suffocating. I couldn't go up there. I couldn't go up to the master bedroom alone, not with the eerie feeling settling over me like a thick blanket. My mind kept racing, and I kept trying to tell myself it was just my imagination, that it was just the house settling, just my nerves getting the best of me. But deep down, I knew something had happened. I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it, but I knew it had. And so I stayed downstairs, not daring to go up to the master bedroom, not daring to go near the stairs. It was the first time in a long while that I felt like I couldn't trust what I was hearing, what I was feeling. The house, the quiet, the noises upstairs, they had all changed. Something was off. Something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to face. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation I had with my friend, about her saying that she had heard me walking around upstairs in the middle of the night. What if it wasn't me? What if it was something else? Something I couldn't see, something I couldn't explain. But I never found the answer. My partner came home, and everything went back to normal. The dogs were their usual selves, barking at everything and nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been different, something had been out of place. And the worst part, I didn't know what it was. I didn't go up to the master bedroom again for a long time. I couldn't bring myself to. I never told my partner about what happened, never told anyone about the sounds, about the feeling of being watched. I kept it to myself, hoping that maybe, with time, the unease would fade. But it didn't. It stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind, always there, a quiet reminder that some things can't be explained away. And so, the house remained silent. But I never quite felt at ease in it again. The sounds from upstairs, the feeling of being watched, they never went away. They just became part of the quiet, part of the things I couldn't explain, part of the things I would never understand. But I didn't go up there again. Not alone. Not ever again. I was walking home from a video shoot that night, carrying a ton of gear. The kind of gear you don't want to mess with. My friend's camera, some tripods, lenses, and of course his laptop, which was in a bag slung over my shoulder. It was late, probably pushing midnight, but it was a nice night, clear sky, no rain. The temperature was decent for a walk across the U of O campus. This neighborhood was usually pretty safe, especially for someone carrying all this equipment. I'd walked this path 1,000 times before without any issues. The campus is kind of quiet at night, but still, it's not completely empty. A few people walk around, some people out for late night studying, maybe a drunk college student or two stumbling around after a night out, but nothing too bad. I figured I'd just head home, grab a quick snack, and crash. As I walked past the business school, I noticed a guy standing on the corner of a side street. At first, I didn't think much of it. He looked kind of scruffy, maybe in his mid-30s, and the way he was standing, shoulders hunched, head a little low, his clothes all wrinkled and a bit dirty, gave off this odd vibe. You know the look. He wasn't facing me, but I caught the way he was swaying slightly as I passed. My eyes slid past him, but I kept walking, just minding my own business, you know? But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. "Hey, get back here," the voice shouted. It was harsh, kind of ragged, and for a second I thought maybe he was talking to someone else. But there wasn't anyone else around. Just me. I tried to ignore it, just focused on the road ahead. My hands were already stiff from carrying all the gear, and my heart rate picked up a bit as I started to feel like maybe this wasn't just some random shout. But I kept walking. The quicker I got out of his line of sight, the better. Then I heard the footsteps. The guy was running after me. I didn't look back. My mind was racing through all sorts of thoughts. I couldn't just take off running. I had all this gear. Dropping it wasn't an option, and I certainly wasn't going to let some random guy get his hands on it. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I turned around slowly, so I could at least see where he was and keep my eye on him. He wasn't far. Maybe 10 feet away by now, and still coming. There was a weird, jittery energy about him. His movements were fast but erratic, kind of twitchy. I could hear him mumbling something, but I couldn't make out the words. His breath was heavy, like he was desperate, like he needed something, needed it badly. "Stop. Stop right there," he shouted again. His voice was more frantic this time. That's when I knew I had to do something. I started walking backwards, my feet shuffling a little faster than usual. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. If he got close enough, I wasn't sure I could fend him off. He was gaining on me. I needed to find somewhere safer, somewhere with more light. I glanced up and saw the safe way up ahead. I kept walking backwards, keeping my eyes locked on him. "Stop, motherfucker," he yelled. And that's when I felt the tug. He reached out and grabbed my camera bag, the one I had hanging over my shoulder. I felt the weight shift as he yanked it. My heart jumped. My grip on the strap tightened, but he was pulling hard. I yanked back, stumbling slightly. My breath quickened. I could feel the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Let go," I yelled, but he wasn't listening. His hands were shaking, and he wasn't letting go. I didn't know what else to do. The worst part was, he wasn't even looking at me. His eyes were wild, unfocused, like he was somewhere else, high or tweaking. He was out of it, and I was just another obstacle to get around. The fact that I had all this equipment wasn't registering in his mind. He just wanted to take something, anything. I quickly reached into my pocket, my hand shaking a bit from the nerves. I always carried a utility knife with me. It wasn't huge, just a small thing, but I knew it could be intimidating. My fingers closed around the handle, and I pulled it out, holding it in front of me. The blade wasn't extended, but I clicked it open, the sound of it echoing in the empty street. I hoped he'd see that. I hoped it would be enough to make him stop. "Get the fuck away from me," I said, holding the knife in front of me like a shield. He paused. I saw his eyes dart to the blade, then back to me. There was a flash of recognition in his gaze, like he realized I wasn't messing around. But he didn't back off. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and he lunged forward again, desperate. I pulled the blade back and snapped it open again. The sound of the knife locking into place was loud and sharp, and this time, he hesitated longer. "Get back," I shouted again, more forcefully this time. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I just wanted him to get the hell away from me, to stop putting his hands on my gear. But he didn't seem to care. I closed the blade and opened it again, right in his face. The sound of the click seemed to register this time. His eyes went wide, and for a moment he backed off, just enough for me to jerk my bag out of his reach. That was enough. He let go and backed up a few steps, his breathing heavy, his gaze flicking around nervously. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but nothing came out except a few incomprehensible words. "I'm about to knock you out," he said. But the words were slurred, half distracted. That's when I saw the look in his eyes shift. There was fear in them. Not fear of me, fear of what he was doing, fear of the consequences. But it wasn't enough to stop him. His eyes darted to the street corner. "I got people," he muttered, almost to himself. "My friends are close." That was my cue. I didn't wait around to see if he meant it. I spun around and started running. My heart was pounding in my chest, but the fear was pushing me forward. I didn't look back as I sprinted toward Safeway, the streetlights flickering above me, the noise of my footsteps echoing in my ears. But then, I looked over my shoulder. A group of guys, maybe 4 or 5, was coming around the corner, walking fast. They were tall, and the way they moved slow, deliberate, like they were looking for something, sent a chill down my spine. My stomach dropped. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I reached the Safeway parking lot. I could hear them getting closer, but I wasn't going to let them catch me. I kept running, straight for the doors of the Safeway. When I pushed them open, I could hear the group shouting something behind me, but I didn't look back. I headed straight for the phone booth in the corner, grabbed my phone, and dialed a friend's number, barely able to keep my hands from shaking. "Hey, are you close? I need a ride." Now, my friend picked up after the second ring, and I told them exactly where I was. They said they'd be there in a few minutes. I hung up and stood there in the store, watching the parking lot through the windows. The group of guys was still walking slowly around the block. They hadn't seen me yet, but I was starting to feel that terrifying sense of time running out. When my friend showed up, I didn't waste any time. I rushed out to their car and jumped in the passenger seat. We drove off quickly, not looking back. I knew I'd made it out, but it wasn't the kind of relief I was used to. The tension stayed with me the whole way home, like I was still being chased, like I couldn't fully escape the feeling of his hands pulling at my bag. Later, when I got back to my apartment, I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to something much worse. I wasn't sure if the guy had meant to hurt me, or if he was just so out of it that he couldn't think straight. But what I did know was that I was lucky to have gotten away without more than a scare. There was no way to predict what a person like that would do when they were desperate. And that thought lingered with me for a long time, long after I went to bed that night. I was sitting in the dining room of the house, alone, the house quiet except for the sound of my own breathing. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left on the planet, or maybe that you're about to hear something that you weren't supposed to. My family had been bustling around the house earlier in the day, getting ready for a trip to the park. My mother, my brother, and my cousin had all been in the kitchen, moving about in their usual way, preparing for a fun afternoon. I stayed behind, content with the idea of just waiting for my friends to pick me up. The house always felt a little more peaceful when I was alone, though the quiet could also be a bit unsettling. It wasn't until they left and the door clicked shut behind them that the stillness truly set in. I had barely gotten used to it when the noise came. A loud thud echoed up from my brother's room upstairs. At first, I thought it must be him. Maybe he was still at home, messing around in his room. But no, I remembered almost instantly that my brother and cousin had gone with my mom to the park. My heart skipped a beat as the thought of someone else being in the house flickered through my mind. I wasn't sure what I should do. I felt this irrational sense of urgency to check on my brother, even though I knew, in some logical corner of my brain, that he wasn't even there. Still, the noise had rattled me. I stood up slowly, trying to quiet the rising panic inside me. I was halfway through the dining room, standing by the edge of the table, when I heard it again. A creak, unmistakable and sharp. It was the sound of someone walking down the stairs. I froze. I wasn't about to look. I didn't want to look. The idea of seeing someone, or something, come down those stairs was enough to paralyze me where I stood. My mind was racing now, adrenaline flooding my system. I had to do something. I didn't know what, but I had to do something fast. The creaking continued, each step deliberate and slow. It was like the person, or whatever it was, knew I was listening. I could almost hear its footsteps drawing closer to the bottom of the stairs. I spun around, my breath quickening. The kitchen was right there. I hurried into the dark, cool space, feeling the familiar chill of the tile against my bare feet. There was a knife drawer just to the right, and I grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find, still shaking. Holding it in my hand, I moved carefully back toward the door to the dining room, pressing my back against the wall. My ears strained to catch every sound. The house was so old, every noise seemed amplified. The stairs creaked again, but this time it was louder, as if whoever was coming down was nearly at the bottom. I could almost hear their breath, slow and even, but unmistakably there. I barely dared to breathe. The kitchen knife felt heavy in my hand, but I gripped it tighter, watching the doorway with wide eyes. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest I was sure I would be heard, no matter how quiet I tried to be. Then there was the sound of glass clinking, like plates being touched together. The sound echoed from somewhere in the living room or dining room, but it only made my fear worse. It was like someone was already in the house, moving around as if they belonged here. I sat on the kitchen floor, knees pulled to my chest, holding the knife with both hands, hoping the silence would return. The footsteps on the stairs had stopped, but I didn't dare move. I was paralyzed, trying to stay as still as possible, praying that whatever was in the house didn't know I was right there. A few minutes later, I heard a distant honk from outside. My friend was here. I couldn't run fast enough. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet and rushed out of the kitchen, through the dining room, and straight to the front door. I flung it open and bolted to my friend's car, nearly tripping over my own feet in my panic. I slid into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't even look back at the house, my eyes fixed on the road as my friend pulled away. It wasn't until we were a few miles down the road that I exhaled deeply, trying to calm my nerves. He glanced over at me, a grin on his face, clearly unaware of the depth of my fear. "You okay?" he asked, clearly not knowing what had just happened. I nodded quickly, but the words tumbled out anyway. "There was someone in the house," I said, my voice a little shaky. He laughed. "What? You mean like a ghost or something?" I shook my head. "No, I don't know what it was, but I wasn't going upstairs to find out." He laughed again, as though the idea was absurd. I would have gone upstairs to check. "I didn't want to die today," I replied flatly. It sounded ridiculous even as I said it, but the memory of that noise, the way it echoed in the house, as if something was slowly making its way down the stairs, was enough to make me feel like I'd made the right choice. When I finally returned home hours later, the house was just as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing had moved. The silence hung in the air, thick and still, but I didn't hear anything that would have explained the noises I had heard earlier. That night, I went to bed and didn't speak to anyone about it. I didn't even tell my family. They were too busy with their own lives, and it seemed like a stupid thing to bring up. I knew no one would believe me, and I wasn't about to spend the night trying to convince anyone. As for my parents, their experience in the same house was just as unsettling, though it happened before that day. It was about a year before that incident when my brother and I were away at a friend's house for the weekend. My parents had stayed home, probably looking forward to a quiet evening. They were up late, watching TV and talking about the pictures they'd taken the day before. They'd been looking through the photos, noting the strange, blurry orbs in most of the shots, but they didn't think much of it. It wasn't until they were in the living room, chatting, that the strange event occurred. My dad had been sitting in his recliner while my mom relaxed on the couch, which was near the stairs. It was late, and they were both getting tired, but they kept talking. Suddenly, the end of the couch where my mom was sitting began to lift, slowly, like someone was pulling it from the ground. My mom's eyes went wide, and she froze, unsure of what was happening. The couch was rising, lifting off the ground at least a foot or more, before it fell back down with a loud bang, shaking the entire house. My dad, always the practical one, didn't hesitate. He shot up from his chair and stormed through the house, yelling at the top of his lungs. He shouted at the house, demanding it leave them alone. "You will leave my family alone," he yelled. "Do not touch them. Do not hurt them. Do not show yourselves." He went through every room in the house, screaming until his voice was hoarse. My mom sat there, frozen in terror, unsure of what to do or how to react. She had never seen my dad so frightened. After the yelling had stopped, everything was eerily quiet. From then on, my parents never spoke much about what happened, but we all noticed the orbs in the photos and the occasional shadow that seemed to move on its own. We never figured out what caused those events, but they certainly left an impression. I'm just glad I don't live there anymore. The house, for all its old charm, was never the same after those things happened. It was like something had shifted, and we were no longer alone in that house. Maybe we never had been. I had never been one to believe in anything beyond the physical. Spirits, ghosts, or supernatural events. Those kinds of things never made sense to me. I was a rational person, someone who based everything on science and logic. But that night, well, that night still haunts me. I can't explain it, and I don't know how to make sense of it. It was the night after my aunt passed away, and I found myself alone in my room, trying to rest, trying to find some peace from the heavy weight of grief that had settled on my chest. My aunt had been a huge part of my life. She wasn't just family, she was a friend, a confidant. Her death left a gaping hole that no one could fill. That night, I found it hard to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, her face would appear, her smile, her voice. I couldn't stop thinking about the moments we'd shared, and it was as if she was still somehow there, lingering around me, even though she was gone. I had been crying for hours, the tears flowing freely. I wasn't someone who normally cried in front of others, but tonight, the sorrow was too much. My dog, Max, had been lying next to me the whole time, his head resting on my lap. Max was a large German shepherd, fiercely loyal and protective, but he was also calm, a creature of routine. He rarely barked at anything. He only growled when something truly upset him. I didn't think much of it when I noticed him stir. He got up from his spot and walked over to the edge of the bed, standing there for a moment, his ears perked. I didn't think it was anything special at first. Dogs, after all, have sharp senses. Maybe he heard something outside, a noise I didn't catch. But then, Max started to growl. Now, if you've ever had a dog like mine, you know how rare it is for them to make a sound like that. He wasn't a dog who barked at the wind or growled for no reason. His growls were reserved for something real, something that bothered him. I sat up in bed, wiping my eyes, and turned to look at him. Max was staring straight at the door, his body tense, his growl growing deeper. He wasn't barking, just a low, steady growl that sent a chill down my spine. I felt a strange knot in my stomach as I looked at him, trying to understand why he was acting this way. The door to my room was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light from the hallway to sneak through. It was dark outside, and the house was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no breeze coming in from the window, no sound from the streets outside. But Max kept his eyes fixed on the door, and I felt my heart rate quicken. I got out of bed, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was nothing. Max was just being his usual protective self. But as I walked towards him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I reached him, I turned to look at the door. At first, I didn't see anything, just the faint outline of the doorframe and the shadow cast by the light in the hallway. But then, as I stared longer, I saw it. A shape, a dark, black shape standing just on the other side of the door. It wasn't clear, like it was still half a shadow, but it was unmistakable. I blinked a few times, trying to clear my vision. I thought maybe it was just my tears messing with my sight, distorting things. I looked back at Max, whose growl had softened but didn't completely go away. He was still fixated on the door. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, my grief distorting my perception. So, I laid back down in bed, trying to shake off the eerie feeling in my chest. Max, after a few more moments of growling, lay back down too. He didn't seem as tense, but I could tell he was still on alert. I pulled the covers up to my chin, hoping to settle into a peaceful sleep, but it wasn't coming. I closed my eyes, but the darkness seemed to weigh on me, thick and suffocating. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting. I tried to focus on the sound of my breath, the soft, steady rhythm, but every time I started to drift off, my mind would snap back to the image of that dark shape by the door. Then it happened again. Max's growl broke the silence. It wasn't as soft this time. It was more intense, more urgent. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Max was standing again, his eyes locked on the door. His growl was deep and fierce, almost like a warning. Before I could even think, I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, just a whisper, but it was clear. A single word. Goodbye. I froze. Goodbye, JR. The voice was soft, but it carried a sense of finality, as if the speaker was speaking from a great distance. The words lingered in the air, hanging heavy and thick. I scrambled out of bed, my legs shaking beneath me. My pulse was racing, my mind reeling. Who said that? What did it mean? I scanned the room, my eyes darting from corner to corner, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that could explain what I had just heard. There was no one there. I rushed to the door, throwing it open, but the hallway was empty. No one in sight. I walked into the hallway and checked the rest of the house, but it was silent. The air felt thick, like the whole house was holding its breath. I looked out the window into the darkness, but all I could see was the moonlight shining down on the quiet street. No one was around, but something felt wrong. Something about the voice, about the way Max was acting, felt completely out of place. I didn't know what it was, but it was like the air itself had shifted. I turned back toward my room and walked in, my heart still racing. I glanced at Max, who was still staring at the door. His growl had stopped, but the tension in his body hadn't. He was alert, watching something unseen. Then something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, near the window, were the balloons. They had been there for days, tied together in a cluster, remnants of something I had done earlier. Some balloons left over from a celebration. They were tied to a weight, held down by a string. They weren't going anywhere. But now, one of them had come loose. It floated in the air, moving slowly, drifting in circles around the room. I froze again. I hadn't touched them, and there was no wind in the room to move them. But there it was, drifting in the air like someone had cut the string, like someone was holding it. The weight of what I had just seen, and what I had heard, was too much. The voice still echoed in my mind, and the sight of the balloon spinning in circles felt like the final confirmation that something was wrong, that I couldn't explain. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that there was a reasonable explanation. But nothing made sense. There was no way a balloon could float like that unless someone had untied it. But I was alone. I couldn't explain it. I still don't know what happened that night. I didn't see a ghost. I didn't have a supernatural encounter, but I can't ignore what I heard and what I saw. The voice, the balloon, the way Max had reacted. There's no simple explanation for it. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the window, staring into the dark, waiting for something to make sense of it all. But in the end, I never found an answer. All I know is that sometimes things happen that you can't explain, no matter how hard you try. And sometimes you have to live with the unease of not knowing what it all means. I've never been the same since that night. I remember it so clearly, the morning we moved. It was early, around 6:30, maybe 7, the time when everything is still a little hazy, and the house is quiet, just waiting for the chaos of the day to unfold. We were in the middle of one of those big life changes, moving across the country. My family had been in our old place for a while, but we'd finally sold it, and now we were headed for a new start in a completely different city on the other side of Canada. It was all happening so quickly, and I don't think any of us had really processed the full impact yet. We were busy with the details, sorting through our things, packing the last-minute items, and making sure everything was in order for the movers to take over. The movers arrived early in the morning, as expected. There was a group of them, probably about 4 or 5, and they seemed friendly enough. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but I was standing by the stairs, watching as they began to unload the truck. The day was cool, and there was a soft gray light creeping in through the windows, giving everything a sleepy, muted quality. I was chatting with the driver, who was a man in his mid-30s, maybe a little older. He seemed a bit tired, but I figured it was just because of the early hour. His name was Steve, I think, though I can't be certain anymore. He was saying something about his route and how long he'd been driving. I didn't think much of it at the time. He seemed nice enough, not too talkative but not rude either. I was half listening to him, distracted by the movers as they started moving furniture up the stairs and through the door. Then, in the middle of his sentence, something changed. I wasn't really paying full attention to him at first, just nodding along. But then I noticed that his voice had stopped mid-sentence. It wasn't that he was pausing for dramatic effect, or that he had lost his train of thought. No, it was something else. I looked over at him, and that's when I saw it, the look in his eyes. He was staring at me, wide-eyed, his pupils almost too large for his eyes. It was like he wasn't really seeing me, like his focus had completely shifted. I remember feeling a cold shiver run down my spine as I registered the weird, frantic energy radiating off him. And then there was that noise. At first, I thought maybe he was just clearing his throat, or maybe trying to hold in a laugh. But no, it wasn't a laugh. It was more like a cracking sound, a twisted noise, almost like a distorted chuckle that didn't quite match the situation. It was so strange, and it made my stomach drop. I stood there frozen for a second, not sure what to do, but then things started to get worse. Steve bent down, not in the usual way, like he was trying to tie his shoe or pick something up, but in a jerky, exaggerated movement. He hunched over, his body making weird, unnatural angles as he lowered himself. It looked wrong, like his joints weren't working how they were supposed to, and that's when I realized he wasn't just bending, he was collapsing. He fell onto the stairs behind him, his body sliding down slowly, like his muscles weren't responding. His face went pale, and his breathing became shallow, like he couldn't catch his breath. I was still standing there, not moving, just staring in disbelief. I felt this horrible wave of panic building in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Everything was happening so fast. It was one of the other movers who snapped into action first. She came running over, shouting for help, and I could hear her voice shaking. She bent down beside Steve, and in a second, she recognized what was happening. He was having a seizure. I don't know how she knew, but she did, and it was like something clicked in my brain. I realized, with sudden clarity, that this was real. This wasn't just some strange moment. Steve needed help, and he needed it fast. I could hear her calling for the other movers, shouting that we needed an ambulance, that Steve was in trouble. I don't even remember how long it took for the ambulance to arrive. It felt like an eternity, like the world was standing still while everything around me was spinning out of control. The entire time, Steve lay there twitching, his body jerking every so often, and it was the scariest thing I'd ever witnessed. His face was so pale, and there was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked so vulnerable, and I couldn't shake the thought that this could end very badly. What if the ambulance didn't make it in time? What if something happened to him right there in front of us? The thought of that was enough to make my heart race. But eventually, the paramedics arrived. They took over quickly, setting to work with practiced ease, checking his vitals, making sure he was stable. One of the paramedics looked over at me briefly, just enough to reassure me that they knew what they were doing. It didn't take too long before they managed to get Steve onto a stretcher and started to move him out of the house. I watched them load him into the ambulance, still processing what had just happened. I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. One minute we were just talking, and the next, Steve was on the ground, fighting for control of his own body. It was surreal. We were all left standing there, in the quiet aftermath, unsure of what to do next. The movers tried to get back to work, but the energy had shifted. Everything felt different. No one knew if Steve was going to be okay, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. What if he wasn't? The ambulance finally left, and we were told that Steve had been taken to the hospital to get checked out. It wasn't until a few hours later that we received a call from the moving company. Steve had been given a clean bill of health. The doctors had run some tests, and it turned out that it wasn't anything life-threatening. He had just had a seizure, and they couldn't explain why it had happened. But he was stable now, and they assured us he would be able to finish the job. When I heard that, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but at the same time, a sense of unease still lingered. He had been about to drive all of our things across Canada. The idea of him being behind the wheel, especially after what had just happened, was terrifying. What if something happened again? What if he had another seizure while driving? For his sake and ours, I couldn't shake the worry. But there was nothing to do about it. The moving company reassured us that Steve was fit to drive, that he was cleared to continue the trip. So, we had to trust them. We packed up the rest of our things, and by the time the truck was ready to leave, Steve was back, looking pale but steady. He gave us a half smile as he climbed into the driver's seat, and I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. As they drove off, I kept thinking about what had happened. The image of Steve lying on the stairs, convulsing and unable to move, haunted me. But I also had to admit that I was impressed by how calm everyone had been. It had been a terrifying moment, but we had all pulled together, and that was what made it bearable. The rest of the move went smoothly after that, but I kept checking in with the moving company every now and then to make sure everything was okay. A week later, we received a call from the company telling us that Steve had made it safely to the new city, that our things had arrived without issue. He had driven across the country without a single problem. It was a relief, to say the least. I don't think I'll ever forget that morning, though. The way everything shifted so suddenly, the way life just paused for a moment as we watched a man fight for control of his own body. But in the end, it was a good ending. Steve was okay. He made it through the trip, and he was able to go on with his life. And honestly, despite how scary everything had been, I couldn't help but feel a little grateful. Grateful that we were all there for him when he needed it. Grateful that things turned out okay. It was a strange, unsettling experience, but it made me realize how fragile life can be, and how important it is to stick together in moments like that. So, in the end, everything worked out. Steve got through the move, we got settled in our new home, and life went on. I used to have this recurring nightmare when I was younger, especially when I was sick. I remember it so vividly, even now. It would always start the same way, sitting at a big family lunch in a restaurant. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was one of those towering high-rise places, always busy, with the sound of clinking dishes and chatter all around. The windows stretched so high that when I looked up, I could see the city stretching out far below, like I was floating in the middle of everything. The restaurant was buzzing with people. The noise, the smells, the feeling of being surrounded by so many strangers. It was overwhelming but comforting, like it was all just part of the routine. At least, that's how it felt before things started to go wrong. I remember being seated at a table with my family. It was the usual setup: mom, dad, my siblings, maybe even some cousins. The table was full of food, all kinds of dishes I couldn't quite place. I would always be too distracted by the noise, the conversations, and the movement around me to focus too much on the food. It didn't matter what was on the table anyway. My attention was always drawn elsewhere. At some point, I would glance up from my plate, and that's when I saw him, the scarecrow. I don't even know why it scared me so much. It didn't make sense. It wasn't even like a real scarecrow, like one you'd see in a field. It was just out of place. A tall, thin figure, stiff as a board, standing across the room at the far end of the restaurant. It didn't belong there. I could never see its face clearly, but I knew it was watching me. There was something about it, something about its posture, the way it just stood there motionless, that made my stomach tighten. The figure would always be in the corner of the restaurant, surrounded by tables of people eating, chatting, laughing. But there it was, just standing. And somehow, in the middle of all that noise and bustle, it felt like the only thing that mattered. The worst part was the way it made me feel. Panic would rise in my chest. I had to get away. I couldn't explain it to anyone. I didn't even have the words to describe it. But somehow, I knew that if I didn't leave, if I didn't get away from the scarecrow, something bad would happen. Something would come for me. So, without really thinking about it, I would stand up from the table. The noise around me would fade into the background, like I was in my own world, and all that mattered was escaping that figure. I would look back at my family, sitting there, unaware, and somehow I knew that they weren't the ones I needed to worry about. It was me. It was always me. I'd walk toward the elevator at the far side of the restaurant. I remember the cold, metallic feel of the buttons under my fingers as I'd press the down arrow. The elevator doors would open with a soft ding, and I would step inside. Every time I did, it felt like a sigh of relief. The doors would close, and the world outside would fall away, leaving me in the silence of the elevator. But it was never the end of the nightmare. The elevator would descend, and I'd find myself stepping into a completely different place. It wasn't the same restaurant anymore. It wasn't even a building. It was a market, a crowded, chaotic market, far below the restaurant, in the bowels of the city. There were narrow alleyways lined with stalls, the air thick with the scent of spices, meats, and unfamiliar foods. People bustled around, shouting in languages I couldn't understand. The sounds were a blur of foreign words, laughter, and the clattering of carts. It felt like being lost in a labyrinth, where every corner held another row of people, more faces I couldn't recognize. I would walk through the market, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to figure out how to escape this place. But there was always a feeling of being watched. I could never shake the feeling that the scarecrow was still there. And it was. I would hear the shuffling of feet behind me, and then I'd see him again, always the same, tall and stiff, just moving through the crowd. It didn't matter how fast I walked, or how many corners I turned. He was always there. There was something about the way he moved, like he was gliding through the crowd, always a few steps behind me. It wasn't a normal chase, not like in most dreams where the ground feels too soft to run on, or where you can't move at all. No, this felt like a real chase. Every time I thought I was getting away, he would be there, just around the corner. Sometimes I would find myself dodging through the market, trying to lose him, but there was always an obstacle. A cart blocking my way, people crowding the narrow alleys, stalls of goods that seemed to slow me down. No matter how hard I tried, I could never outrun him. I could hear him getting closer, the heavy footsteps echoing behind me. My heart would race in my chest, and my breath would come in quick, shallow gasps as I pushed myself to go faster, my legs burning with each step. Eventually, I would always wake up before he caught me. I'd be panting, drenched in sweat, heart hammering in my chest. I'd lay there, frozen, trying to calm myself down, my mind spinning. I never knew what the scarecrow wanted, why it was chasing me, or what would happen if it ever caught me. But the fear was always so real, so consuming, that it would take me forever to fall asleep again. It felt like the kind of nightmare that was never going to go away. But then, as quickly as it came, the nightmare would stop. After a few nights of terror, the scarecrow would disappear, and I'd go weeks, sometimes months, without dreaming of him again. But the fear always lingered, like something just out of reach, waiting to come back. And then it would return. One week, after I'd dreamt of the scarecrow for more than 3 nights in a row, something changed. Everything was the same: the restaurant, the elevator, the market. But that night, when I turned to look for the scarecrow, he wasn't the only one there. My cousins appeared. They came out of nowhere, as if they'd just been waiting for the right moment. They were running through the market, their capes fluttering behind them, their faces set with determination. They didn't look scared like I did. They were calm, like they had done this before, like they were here to help. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. They grabbed my hands, and without missing a beat, they started pulling me through the crowd, guiding me around stalls, ducking past vendors who didn't seem to notice us. I could hear the scarecrow behind us, still moving through the market, but my cousins were faster. They were so fast, and I could feel their grip tightening around my wrist, pulling me along with them, their capes flowing out behind them like banners in the wind. We ran through the chaos, darting between people, around carts, up alleyways. There was a kind of calm now, like everything was under control, like I wasn't alone anymore. My cousins didn't speak, but I could feel their presence, their focus, as we made our way through the market, farther and farther away from the scarecrow. Eventually, we reached the edge of the market, where the crowd started to thin. I looked back, expecting to see the scarecrow close behind, but he was gone. Just like that. It was as if he'd never been there in the first place. My cousins stopped in the quiet of the open space, still holding my hands. They turned to face me, their expressions softening as they let go of me. I felt safe. I felt protected. It was as if, in that moment, everything had changed. That was the last time I ever had the nightmare. It's funny. I never really thought about it until much later, but the nightmares stopped the night my cousins rescued me. I never saw the scarecrow again. I don't know why they appeared that night, why they were the ones to come to my aid, but they did. And ever since that night, I've never been haunted by the scarecrow again. I don't know if it was the presence of my cousins, the fact that I wasn't alone anymore, or something else entirely, but whatever it was, it worked. The nightmares faded, and I was free from that fear. Years later, I still remember that night, and I still feel a strange sense of relief when I think about it. The scarecrow was never more than a nightmare. But my cousins, they'll always be my heroes. It was the summer of 1973. I had just wrapped up my second year of college, and during those years, I'd gotten heavily involved in volunteering as a Girl Scout leader. We had our regular meetings, of course, but there were always the weekend getaways. Those weekends spent with a bunch of energetic girls who wanted nothing more than to explore the world around them. And being a part of that, I loved it. It felt good to be part of something bigger, especially at a time when I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do with my life. The weekend I'm about to talk about changed everything for me, though. It was one of those trips that, when I think back on it now, still makes my skin crawl. Not for the reasons you might expect, but because of the way things just felt wrong, even though everything seemed fine at the time. We were staying at Camp Scott, a place that was supposed to be a safe haven for Girl Scouts like mine. It wasn't a fancy camp, just a rustic place, a cabin with basic amenities. It wasn't too far from town, but it felt like it was in the middle of nowhere when you were standing in the woods looking out. The air always smelled of pine and earth, and during the day, you could hear the laughter of girls running around, enjoying the outdoors. At night, the only sounds you heard were the whispers of the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustle of an animal in the underbrush. The cabins were simple. They were made of thick, weathered wood, and the windows were always open to let in the night air. My girls and I were sharing one of the smaller cabins, a single room with a big stone fireplace, bunk beds lining the walls, and a small table in the center where we could gather for meetings or meals. The first night was calm. The girls settled in quickly, the excitement of the camp settling over them like a blanket. I didn't think too much of it when they'd go on about the sounds in the woods or talk about what they thought they'd seen in the trees. It's just the kind of thing that happens when you're out in the middle of the woods. But on that second night, something was off. Around midnight, I woke up to a low, almost continuous sound, the sound of dogs barking. It was a little odd because the dogs around the camp were usually pretty calm. Hunters would sometimes bring them in, but they rarely wandered into the camp area itself. These dogs, though, were agitated. I could tell by their bark, sharp, frantic. They sounded like they were right outside the cabin. But when I peeked out the window, I couldn't see anything. I tried to ignore it at first, but the barking kept growing more intense. It wasn't like the usual distant barking I might hear from a few campsites over. These dogs sounded like they were right underneath us. I got up, pulled on a sweater, and went outside to see what was going on. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with that eerie stillness that always seems to happen in the middle of the night. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. I stood outside the cabin for a few moments, listening. The barking was louder now, unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the nearby trail or the trees. It was directly under the cabin. At first, I thought maybe there was some sort of wild animal underneath it, or perhaps some campers' dogs had gotten loose. But the more I listened, the more it became clear that these were hunting dogs, the kind that were used for tracking, trained, and focused. I stepped back inside the cabin, trying not to disturb the girls too much. I figured I'd just go outside to see if I could calm the dogs down, maybe lead them away from the cabin. But the dogs didn't stop. They were still barking and crying, like they were trapped or in some kind of distress. I found myself pacing, unsure of what to do. By the time I was about to go out again, one of the girls woke up. She had been crying, scared by the noise. I told her to go back to sleep and assured her that I would take care of it. But as I stepped out onto the porch again, a chill crept up my spine. The dogs were now growling, low, rumbling growls that sent a wave of unease over me. I wanted to check under the cabin, but I was hesitant. The darkness beneath the building felt thick, oppressive. I had an overwhelming sense that something was wrong, something I couldn't see. I tried to convince myself that it was just the dogs, that maybe something in the woods had spooked them. But the feeling that I was being watched crept up on me. I moved back inside and tried to sleep, but it was useless. The noise kept me up. It was like the dogs knew something I didn't, something I couldn't see. But when morning finally came, the barking stopped. The camp was peaceful again. The girls woke up as usual, excited for the day ahead. We packed up and left the next morning. I didn't think too much of it after that. It was just a weird night. But the next weekend, a news story shook me to my core. 3 girls from a nearby camp were kidnapped that weekend. They were taken from their cabin, just like ours. The reports came out over the next few days. The girls were brutally attacked, raped, and murdered. It was a tragedy that no one expected. Nothing anyone could have predicted. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I started to wonder if that night, the dogs, the barking, the crying, they had known something I didn't. What if the person responsible for those awful crimes had been nearby that night? What if they were watching us, or worse, had been there for the same reason I had, watching the camp, making sure the girls were asleep before they did what they did? The dogs were the only thing that seemed to sense it, knew something was wrong, and they'd been spooked. That thought haunted me for a long time. It still does. There's no way to know for sure, of course. There's no way to prove it, but it was the only thing that made sense. The dogs wouldn't have reacted that way for no reason. And whatever it was that had spooked them, it was close, too close. After that, I couldn't help but think about those girls who didn't make it. I always wondered if I could have done something more, if I could have stayed up longer, paid closer attention. But there was no way to know what would have happened if the dogs hadn't been there that night. Maybe they sensed the danger, maybe they didn't. All I know is that I'll never forget the way the dogs sounded, the way they cried and barked under that cabin, like they were trying to warn us of something terrible. Something that was lurking too close, waiting for the right moment. Camp Scott was closed after that, and I never went back. I couldn't. It just didn't feel right. Even today, whenever I think back to that night, I can still hear the echoes of those barking dogs, and I can't shake the feeling that someone, was hiding in the woods waiting. The night was still, almost unnaturally so. It was the middle of summer, and like every other summer night, the air was thick and humid, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes you want to do nothing more than escape into water. My friend and I were both stuck in that bored, restless haze that often sets in late at night during vacation. There was something about the quiet of the world, the weight of the night pressing down, that made everything feel like it was suspended in time. It was around 1 or 2 a.m., and we'd been chatting online for hours, our conversation trailing off, and then coming back around to the same thing. How insanely hot it was. I could hear the sound of my own breathing in the silence. And then my friend typed something in the chat that caught my attention. He said something about how it was too hot to be inside, and how he was going a little crazy being stuck in his room. The idea popped into my head instantly. "Let's go to the lake," I typed back. "The one in the forest." I didn't really think much of it at the time, but the idea felt like it might break the monotony. The lake was a short walk from my house, tucked away deep in the forest. It wasn't the kind of place most people went, especially at night. I don't think I'd ever gone there in the dark, not alone anyway, but I was bored. It seemed like the perfect thing to do in that weird space of time between late night and early morning when the world feels like it's holding its breath. He replied quickly, "I'm down." So, at 2 a.m., we met up by my house. We didn't have a plan, no real idea of what we were doing except to swim in the lake. I grabbed a flashlight, tossed on some old swimming shorts, and we made our way through the quiet streets of the neighborhood and down into the forest. The path to the lake wasn't difficult to find, but it was dark, so the trees swallowed up any light that might have come from the street lamps. There was something about the forest at night that made everything feel both closer and more distant at the same time. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, thick with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. The further we walked, the darker it got, and I started feeling that familiar unease creeping in. It wasn't anything overt. It wasn't like I could hear footsteps or anything, but in the darkness, you start to hear things differently. Even the sounds of your own steps seem louder. We made it to the lake after about 20 minutes of walking. The air around the water felt cooler, but not enough to really relieve the sticky heat of the summer night. The moon barely lit the surface of the lake, just enough to make the water look like black glass, reflecting the faint stars above. We didn't talk much as we undressed down to our swimming trunks. The quiet was peaceful, almost comforting. A nice break from the screen light and the constant buzz of the online world. I turned on the flashlight and placed it on a rock near the water, pointed at the shore, so we'd know where to find our stuff when we got back. It wasn't the brightest light, but it was enough to cast a dim glow across the shore. "Ready?" my friend asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, feeling the familiar nervous thrill in my chest. The water looked cold, but it was inviting. So we both waded in, the chill of the lake creeping up our legs, making us both gasp. But it wasn't long before we were fully submerged, and the coolness felt good against the heat. The water, despite the darkness, seemed endless, stretching out before us in a way that made the shore feel farther and farther away. We swam out for about 50 meters, keeping the shore in sight, but also enjoying the freedom of being out in the deep water. I'm not sure if it was the dark or just my general unease with deep water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The kind of unease you get when you're in a place you're not quite familiar with, but you don't know why. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. But it wasn't easy. We stopped, treading water, and I glanced back toward the shore. That's when it happened. The flashlight flickered. At first, I thought I imagined it. Maybe the beam just caught the wind or something. But then it flickered again, and I saw the beam of light flash off and on twice, like someone had walked past it. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. My friend must have seen it too, because he turned to me and said what I was already thinking. "Did you see that?" he asked. I nodded, my mind racing. It wasn't a big deal, right? It could have been an animal, a raccoon or something that wandered too close. But then why did it flicker like that? Why had the light flashed in a way that made it seem like someone was moving around it? I turned back toward the shore, scanning the darkness. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. For a while, we stayed in the water, not saying anything. The flickering stopped after a few minutes, but the unease didn't. I tried to shake it off, but every time I looked back toward the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching us. And that feeling, that sensation of being watched, only grew stronger the longer we stayed in the water. After a few minutes of silence, we both agreed to swim back. We weren't talking much, but I could tell my friend felt it too. That underlying discomfort, the kind that creeps up on you when you're somewhere you shouldn't be. The swim back to shore felt longer, the water colder, as if the lake itself was pulling us in. Finally, we reached the shore, and I didn't waste a second climbing out of the water. We quickly changed back into our clothes, hurrying to get back on solid ground. But as I reached down to grab the flashlight, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A shoe. It was lying next to the flashlight, just a few inches away from where I'd left it. A single dark shoe. At first, I thought it might have been mine, but I knew it wasn't. I hadn't brought any shoes with me. We both left our shoes back by the water's edge when we changed into our swimming trunks. The shoe wasn't something either of us had worn. It was a muddy, worn-looking sneaker, the kind you might find in a thrift store, but it didn't belong to either of us. I didn't even have to look at my friend's face to know he was thinking the same thing I was. It had not been there when we first arrived. We both stood there for a moment, the reality of what we were seeing sinking in. The chill that crept up my spine made it harder to think straight. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Who would leave a shoe like that in the middle of the forest at 3 a.m.? And why hadn't we seen it when we first got there? I don't know how long we stood there, staring at the shoe, but eventually I snapped out of it. My instinct kicked in, telling me to leave. It was too late for this. Too late to be out here. Too late for anything to make sense. We grabbed the flashlight, and without a word, we both started walking quickly back toward the path. The forest felt different now. Every crack of a twig underfoot seemed amplified. Every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves, felt like something was moving in the dark with us. The walk back was tense, our steps quick but cautious. Neither of us said anything, but we both knew. The air around us had changed. There was something else out there. Something that didn't belong. Something that was not waiting for us to leave the lake. We didn't speak again until we reached the edge of the forest. By then, the sun was starting to break through the horizon, the first light of morning casting faint shadows over the ground. We didn't need to say anything. We knew that neither of us would ever be going back to that lake. And neither of us ever did. To this day, when we talk about that night, we don't need to say much. The memory is enough to send a chill down our spines. But we still wonder, who left the shoe? Who, or what, had been watching us from the darkness? I was 10 years old at the time, a kid with a lot of energy and a tendency to get into trouble. My bedroom was simple, bare walls, a bed pushed against one corner, a few books stacked next to the nightstand, and a little window overlooking the backyard. The house was quiet at night, a little too quiet for my liking sometimes, but I was used to it by then. It was the kind of place where the silence would settle over everything, pressing in on you, like you were the only one awake in a world full of sleeping people. That night, I'd gone to bed as usual. My mom had tucked me in, kissed me goodnight, and turned off the light. The quiet was comforting at first, but then my mind started wandering. It always seemed like it took forever for me to fall asleep, my brain too active, turning over little worries and random thoughts. But eventually, the darkness swallowed me up, and I drifted off to sleep. The dream started out normal enough, like the ones I'd had before. But it quickly turned dark, as most of my nightmares did. I don't remember all the details, but I know the most vivid part of it. There was my older brother, but not the way he usually was. This version of him was darker, not just in appearance, but in the way he moved, the way he looked at me. His eyes weren't the same as usual, cold and empty, like there was no trace of the brother I knew. He was standing over me in the dream, his hands wrapped around my throat, and I couldn't breathe. I struggled, tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision started to blur, the edges of everything going black. It was the feeling of not being able to breathe that stood out the most, heavy, suffocating, and all-consuming. My chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself, and I couldn't escape. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually it stopped. I woke up, gasping for air. The sudden shift from the nightmare to waking reality made everything feel surreal. I remember the way I took that first deep breath, expecting the sweet relief of air filling my lungs. But when I inhaled, there was nothing. I couldn't breathe, not even a little. The panic hit me in an instant, and I was frozen, lying there, unable to take in air. My chest felt tight, constricted, like I was being squeezed from the inside out. It's hard to describe what it's like to feel like you're suffocating, but that's what it was. It wasn't just the physical panic. It was the knowledge that something was wrong, something was terribly wrong. I was in my bed, in the same room I'd always been in, and yet, it felt like the world had flipped upside down. My body was reacting, but my mind was spiraling, caught between the fading remnants of a nightmare and the sudden, horrifying reality that I couldn't breathe. I tried to sit up, but my chest felt heavier. The air wouldn't come, no matter how desperately I tried to inhale. I could feel the panic building, every second more terrifying than the last. I remember my hands clutching at the covers, my heart racing, and my mind screaming for help. But there was no sound, just the frantic rush of my thoughts. I was supposed to be safe in my own room, but in that moment, it felt like I was suffocating in the most terrifying way possible. I wanted to scream for my parents, but all that came out was a rasping, wheezing noise. It wasn't a scream, it was the sound of someone who couldn't get enough air, someone who was trapped in their own body, powerless. I don't know how much time passed, but in that moment, it felt like an eternity. I wasn't even sure if I was still dreaming, or if this was something real. My mind was still hazy from the nightmare, the lines between sleep and waking blurring. I felt like I was going to die. No, I was sure of it. There was no air, no escape. I had no control over what was happening to me, and it was the scariest feeling I had ever known. Just as my thoughts began to spiral into complete panic, I heard a sound. It wasn't a voice or anything I could make out, but I heard something, footsteps, perhaps, or a shift in the air. It was like someone was near, someone who might help. And then, in the dim light that filtered through the crack in the door, I saw my dad. He must have heard me struggling, the wheezing sounds that had started to come out of my throat. Without a word, he rushed over to my side, his presence like a lifeline in that moment. He didn't need to ask what was wrong. He knew. My dad had always been the kind of person who could sense when something was off, even without me saying anything. He pulled me up out of bed, his arms steady and firm around me, supporting me as if he could take the weight of it all. It was strange how quickly things changed. Just moments before, I had been trapped in the suffocating grip of panic, and now I was being lifted, moved. He didn't say anything, just moved me downstairs, away from the oppressive silence of my room. The air downstairs felt different, cooler, fresher somehow, and I could hear my father's calm, steady voice as he tried to soothe me. But all I could focus on was the fact that I still couldn't breathe the way I was supposed to. My chest ached with each shallow breath I took. The panic hadn't completely subsided. I could feel it lingering, just beneath the surface. He stayed with me, sitting next to me on the couch, holding me close as I tried to regain control of my breathing. I could hear him saying something about calming down, about trying to relax. But nothing helped. The panic continued to claw at me, making everything feel worse, more intense. I wanted to tell him that I was scared, but I couldn't get the words out. I couldn't do anything but focus on trying to breathe. It felt like a long time before I was able to finally take a full breath. When it came, it wasn't the relief I had expected. It was a ragged gasp, a desperate intake of air that still didn't feel quite right. But it was something. It was better than nothing. Eventually, the panic began to subside, and I started to calm down. I could breathe, at least somewhat, though my chest still felt tight, as if it had been squeezed and then let go. I stayed sitting on the couch, my dad next to me, keeping me grounded. The feeling of suffocation began to fade, but it left behind an uncomfortable memory, something that would stick with me for a long time. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. I had asthma, something I had struggled with since I was young. But at that moment, it felt different. It felt like the world had stopped, like everything was about to end, and I had no control over it. My asthma had always been there, lurking in the background, but this time it was different. It wasn't just an attack, it was the fear of dying, the terror that gripped me and wouldn't let go. The next few times it happened, I knew what was going on. I knew it wasn't some weird, mystical event. It wasn't a ghost or anything strange. It was asthma, plain and simple. But the terror I felt each time it happened, that was real. The fear of not being able to breathe, of not being able to control what was happening to me, never went away. It didn't matter that I knew what it was, that I could recognize the signs of an asthma attack before it hit. The feeling of being trapped in my own body, of not being able to get air into my lungs, was something I couldn't escape from, no matter how many times it happened. The fear lessened as I grew older, as I learned how to manage my asthma better, how to use inhalers, and how to recognize the early warning signs. But that first attack, that first time when I couldn't breathe, will always stick with me. It was a reminder that sometimes, no matter how safe you feel, no matter how familiar your surroundings are, there are things you can't control. Things that can make you feel helpless, even in your own skin. And in those moments, when your chest feels tight, and the world feels like it's closing in on you, there's nothing you can do but wait for the panic to pass, and hope that the next breath will come easier. I never thought I would be in a situation where I felt like I was going to die. But in the summer of 2004, I found myself trapped in a cave in Utah, fighting for my life in ways I never imagined. It wasn't a ghost or a bear that threatened to kill us. It was something much more terrifying, something as simple and as deadly as water. I had been climbing for a few years and had just started getting into canyoneering. My gym had organized a trip, and I was excited to join a group of people I'd only met a few months ago. We were going to a cave that was supposed to be fairly easy to access, not too far from a well-known climbing area in Utah. It was an opportunity to push myself, learn from more experienced people, and explore a part of the world that I hadn't yet seen. The group was made up of 8 people, all different skill levels, but Rick, the most experienced among us, had been appointed as the leader of the expedition. He was the one who had studied the route, packed the gear, and coordinated everything. Rick was one of those guys who always seemed in control, calm and collected no matter what. As we drove toward the cave, we stopped at a small climbers cafe on the outskirts of the town. There we met Joe, an older guy who was by himself and also heading to the same cave. Joe didn't seem like your typical caver. He was middle-aged, looked like he had a lot of experience, but he also seemed a little off. There was something about him that made me wonder why he was going down into that cave alone, but he was friendly enough, and we ended up deciding to team up with him for the descent. Joe had all the necessary gear, so we figured he was just another person who was into exploring. I didn't think too much of it at the time. We all assumed Joe was a seasoned caver, so when he mentioned he had a bad feeling about the climb, we shrugged it off. It wasn't uncommon for someone to get nervous before a big adventure like this. Besides, I thought we were all going to be fine. It was a beautiful, sunny day, the sky a deep, perfect blue with no clouds in sight. The air was warm, and it felt like nothing could go wrong. After hiking for 2 days to get to the cave's entrance, the day of the descent finally arrived. It was still sunny when we suited up and prepared for the drop. Most of us wore wetsuits because the cave's waters were cold and dark, never seeing the sun. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it was summer, and the heat outside felt far removed from the icy coldness I was about to encounter underground. We began our descent into the cave, and I could feel the air change almost immediately. The temperature dropped, and the sound of our footsteps echoed off the narrow walls. I was still a rookie, barely knowing the basics of map reading and route planning. I had been trained in the basics of canyoneering, but this was my first real test. We were about 200 feet into the cave when the narrow passage opened up into a larger chamber. I was focusing on my footing and the ropes when suddenly I heard something, a low, rumbling sound. At first, it was barely audible, like the hum of a generator in the distance. It made the walls vibrate slightly, but the sound kept growing, getting louder and louder, reverberating through the air. Then came the wind. It was sudden and cold, a rush of air that made me shiver. That's when we heard Joe's voice, screaming. His shout echoed through the cave. Run! Run, run, run! It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a warning. It was a frantic command, one that stopped me in my tracks. I turned and saw him, running toward us with his headlamp shaking, his movements jerky, desperate. The panic hit me in an instant. We were in a narrow, winding passageway, barely wide enough for us to move in a single file. The sound of rushing water was now unmistakable. I didn't understand what was happening at first, but the water was rising fast. I looked down at my feet. What had been a dry floor was now covered with water. It wasn't slow either. In a matter of seconds, it went from my ankles to my knees, and in moments, it was waist-high. I could feel the cold, biting water seeping into my wetsuit, making my movements sluggish and heavy. I turned to run, but my body felt like it was underwater already. Each step was harder to take, the current pushing against me. I looked back. The others were in the same situation, some of them moving faster than others, but all of us struggling. The girls were screaming, panic turning into hysteria. I saw Tracy, one of the girls, standing frozen, her body stiff as the water rose around her. She hadn't even put on her wetsuit. She was just standing there, helpless, in shock. Dave, her boyfriend, finally reached her and started pulling her along, his face full of desperation. I wasn't sure if we'd make it out. The water kept rising. I could hear it now, a roar, like a fire hydrant had been turned on, gushing through the cave, threatening to drown us all. It wasn't just the water. There was the threat of the cave collapsing, of being trapped with no way out. I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. This wasn't just a hike. We weren't just exploring a cave. We were fighting for our lives. The chamber we were in was narrowing, the ceiling getting lower, and we had to wade through the deepening water. It was cold, so cold that it numbed my legs, and each step felt like I was moving through a nightmare. My mind was racing with thoughts. How long until the water rose too high? How long until we were trapped? Would we die down here? The thought of drowning in that dark, icy water was enough to make me feel like I couldn't breathe. Then, something changed. The water wasn't rising as fast. We were still struggling to move forward, but the rush of water had slowed. The wind was gone, and the sound that had been growing louder, more frantic, was now a distant hum. It felt like a brief, surreal pause in the middle of chaos. But I wasn't sure if it was better or worse. The quiet only seemed more ominous, like the calm before the storm. We reached a larger chamber. The water had risen to chest height by then, and we were struggling to stay afloat in the freezing water. I was shivering uncontrollably, my limbs feeling numb as I swam toward the far side of the chamber. Joe was yelling at us to find higher ground, to get into crevices in the rocks. It was the only place where we could possibly escape the floodwater. I scrambled toward a narrow crevice that would give me some relief, a place to hang on to. The others did the same, each of us wedging ourselves into the rocky crevices, hoping it would be enough to keep us safe. The water continued to rise slowly, but it didn't stop. It just kept coming. It didn't seem real. We were all still stuck in our positions, clinging to the rocks and trying to stay calm, though it was impossible. My mind was racing with questions. How long would we last here? Would anyone find us in time? The air was thick with fear, and it felt like every second stretched into an eternity. The silence grew louder, but then, just as suddenly as it had started, the water stopped rising. It wasn't a gradual stop. It was a sudden, almost eerie stillness. The water had finally reached its peak, but it was still high enough to threaten us. The crevices were the only thing keeping us from being submerged. I couldn't see much, just the faint outline of the others, their headlamps glinting in the water. I wasn't sure how much time passed. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. All I could think about was getting out of the cave, getting back to the surface where it was safe. But we couldn't move. The water had trapped us in that chamber, and the only way out was through the flooded paths we'd just come from. It wasn't until Joe started shouting again, this time with more urgency, that we started to move. The water hadn't receded, but it was no longer rising. Our only option was to swim through the freezing water and make our way back to the exit. Rick, the guy who had been in charge of the trip, had forgotten vital gear that Joe, who we had randomly met, had brought. If it weren't for Joe, we would have been stuck in that cave for God knows how long. We wouldn't have had the equipment to climb out, to survive. Tracy might have died from hypothermia. By the time we finally made it to the surface, it had been days. We had to walk back to our cars, through the wilderness, with our clothes soaking wet and our bodies barely able to move. The whole experience felt like a bad dream, but it was real. And that's when I understood something: caving, climbing, hiking. Whatever the adventure is, it can turn deadly in a heartbeat. I never thought I would almost die on a simple canyoneering trip, but it happened, and it left me with a lot of questions, ones that I'll never fully have answers to. How did it happen? Why did we think we were invincible? How could we have been so careless? What if Joe hadn't been there? All I know for sure is that life is fragile. One moment, everything seems normal. The next, you're fighting for your life in a cave, hoping the water doesn't swallow you whole. The house had always been full of memories, a place where my sister and I had spent most of our childhood, laughing, playing, and sometimes fighting like all siblings do. After her passing, things changed. Not drastically at first, but there were moments. Little things. Unexplained sounds. Items shifted slightly from where they were last placed. It wasn't anything sinister, just odd, like the house was trying to tell me something. My sister loved the paranormal. She was always the one in charge when we would play pretend as kids, pretending to talk to spirits or summon the unknown. I was usually the one going along with it, out of curiosity, but never quite believing in any of it. She would sit at the kitchen table, creating makeshift rituals, and I would watch her with a mix of amusement and uncertainty. We had a collection of oddities, crystals, a few tarot cards, and an old pendulum that my stepmother had bought for me and a friend. The lady who sold it to us said it was just a game. Nothing serious, something fun to play with when we were bored. It wasn't until years later that I realized what it truly was. By then, the pendulum had sat in a drawer forgotten. I had lost my sister in 2002 when I was just 12. The cancer had come fast, taking her away in the blink of an eye. She was the one person who understood me more than anyone, and when she was gone, a piece of me went with her. I remember her room, how it smelled faintly of lavender, and how her old posters were still hanging on the walls. Her favorite music would sometimes play on the radio, and I would catch myself stopping whatever I was doing just to listen. I would sit by the window, staring at the stars, wishing for her to somehow come back. I tried to communicate with her in the only way I knew how, by sending her thoughts, hoping somehow they would reach her. Then, in 2005, when I was 15, my father passed away unexpectedly. It was sudden, just like with my sister. The shock of losing him was a blow I couldn't have prepared for. The grief hit me hard, and I didn't know how to handle it. Losing both of them, the two people I loved most in the world, left me feeling lost, broken, and hollow. Years passed. Life moved forward in a way. I tried to find some normalcy, though it was hard. There were moments of happiness, but they were always tinged with sadness. The house, the place where so many memories were created, started feeling emptier. And then it happened. It was December 2012, and I was in the middle of a divorce. Life had been falling apart around me, and I was desperately clinging to whatever semblance of stability I could find. I spent most of my days alone, sitting on the couch in the quiet of the house, trying to distract myself with the internet, anything to escape the feelings of loss and anxiety. It was a cold day, a typical December afternoon, and I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone when I heard a loud bang from the bathroom. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, slowly making my way to the bathroom, unsure of what to expect. The house, as usual, seemed still. The air was thick with silence, the kind of silence that presses in on you. I opened the bathroom door, but nothing was out of place. The towels were hung neatly on the rack, the toiletries were still on the counter, and the floor was spotless. No sign of anything having fallen or caused that noise. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier somehow, thick with an unspoken presence. A thought crossed my mind, one that I hadn't entertained in years: the pendulum. I don't know why, but I walked back into the living room and pulled it out from the drawer where it had been tucked away for years. It was still in its small velvet pouch, the chain cool to the touch as I held it between my fingers. I hadn't used it in a long time, but something about that moment made me want to try again. Sitting back down on the couch, I placed the pendulum in my hand and watched it sway. The movement was slow at first, almost hesitant, as if it didn't quite know what to do. I began asking simple questions, questions I already knew the answers to, just to get a feel for it. "Is today Tuesday?" I asked, and the pendulum swung in a small circle, confirming my guess. I asked if my TV was on, and the pendulum swung back and forth, a firm no. It felt strange, but at the same time, there was something comforting in the certainty of the answers. It was then that I asked something I had never asked before. "Are you there?" I whispered softly, almost unsure of why I asked it. The pendulum moved in a tight circle, and for a moment, I thought it was a fluke. But then I asked again, and again, it moved in a perfect circle, yes. A cold chill crept down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as though something was trying to communicate with me. My sister. I had to know. "Is this you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The pendulum circled again, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what to do. It felt so real, so tangible. I kept asking questions, trying to make sense of it all. "Is Daddy okay?" I asked, suddenly feeling desperate to know. The pendulum moved swiftly in a circle. Yes. I couldn't help it. The tears came. I asked more questions, more personal ones. "Is something bad going to happen?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. The pendulum swung in big, sweeping circles, yes. My heart sank. I felt a weight in my chest, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. I asked again, "Why are you here?" The pendulum swung once more, answering with the same large, comforting circles. Yes, something was coming. I wasn't sure what, but I felt it. It wasn't the kind of something bad that you could prepare for. It was an emotion, a feeling that swirled around the room, darkening the edges of my mind. The pendulum continued to sway, its motion steady and calm, as if it had been guiding me through something bigger than I understood. Eventually, I stopped. I said goodbye, careful not to be rude or dismissive, but part of me was uneasy. What had just happened? Was it real? My mind swirled with doubt, but deep down, a part of me wanted to believe it was my sister. She always had a way of making things feel real, even when I didn't want to admit it. I called my grandmother afterward. She listened quietly, and when I finished telling the story, she was silent for a long moment. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft, "it's better to let them go. You don't need to keep asking." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but her words comforted me. She always had a way of making things feel less heavy, less real, in the best way possible. The rest of the day passed quietly. I went out to meet a friend, trying to shake off the lingering feeling from the pendulum. As I got into my car and started the engine, I noticed something strange. The lights flickered, and the radio went silent for a moment before blasting back on. Then the lights went out entirely, and the dashboard reset itself, as if the car had just been restarted. My heart skipped a beat, and I couldn't help but think about the pendulum. It was just a loose fuse, I told myself, but it felt like more. The car had never done that before, and it hadn't happened since. The following week, it happened again. The lights flickered, the radio reset, and everything felt off. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it just a coincidence? Was it connected to what had happened earlier with the pendulum? I couldn't tell. Part of me wanted to try again, to see if I could communicate more, but something held me back. The feeling I had gotten from the pendulum, that sense of something ominous just below the surface, still lingered. It wasn't a good feeling. I wasn't sure if I was ready to try again. I tucked the pendulum away, back in its drawer, and left it there for a long time. Life carried on, as it always does, with its ups and downs. But deep down, I knew that whatever had happened that day, whatever I had felt, was real. I didn't need another experience to prove it. In the end, I didn't try the pendulum again. Not because I was afraid, but because sometimes you don't need to seek answers. Sometimes it's better to let the unknown remain just that, unknown. The house still felt a little emptier without my sister, but I found comfort in the little things. The faint smell of lavender, the songs on the radio, the moments when I could almost feel her presence, just for a moment. And so, life went on, quieter now, but still full of those small, unexplained occurrences. The day my grandmother shared this story with me, I didn't think much of it. I was just a kid, sitting in her cozy kitchen in the house that always smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread. She had a way of telling stories, soft and deliberate, letting every word land like it was part of something bigger. This story, though, stayed with me. Even now, decades later, I still think about it. She grew up on Nantucket Island, back in the 1920s. Her neighborhood wasn't just any neighborhood. It was a tight-knit community, full of well-off families who were all friends. They knew each other's business, but it wasn't the gossiping kind of knowing. It was the kind of knowing that made a place feel like home. Neighbors helped each other out, watched each other's children, and shared meals without hesitation. It was a simpler time, one where trust and familiarity were things you could count on. The house my grandmother grew up in wasn't anything extravagant by today's standards, but to her, it was the center of her world. A cozy home with white painted walls, wooden floors that creaked with every step, and a front porch that was always filled with potted plants. Her family wasn't the wealthiest in the neighborhood, but they had everything they needed, and their house always felt warm and welcoming. It was the kind of house where you could sit on the front steps with a glass of lemonade and watch the world go by without a care. Next door lived an elderly couple who were more like family than neighbors. The man, Mr. Foster, was the kind of person who had lived through so many things that he could tell stories for hours. He was a gentle soul, with silver hair and a thick mustache, always wearing a cap when he went out for walks. Mrs. Foster, his wife, was just as kind. She had the most amazing cookies, and every time my grandmother would visit, she'd make sure to have a plate ready for her. Their house was a little older, with ivy crawling up the walls, and a garden that was always in bloom. It was a peaceful place, one that felt timeless. For a while, my grandmother would spend hours over at the Foster's house, playing checkers with Mr. Foster, listening to his stories about the past, or just sitting with Mrs. Foster in the kitchen while she baked. They didn't have children of their own, so they treated my grandmother like the granddaughter they never had. It was the kind of relationship that you couldn't fake. They loved her like their own. Then one day, things started to change. Mr. Foster fell ill. It was a slow decline at first, a little cough here, some tiredness there. But over the course of a few weeks, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. My grandmother could remember how quiet it became around their house. The once lively conversations between Mr. and Mrs. Foster turned into hushed tones. Neighbors started visiting more often, bringing soup, flowers, and anything they could think of to help. But nothing seemed to work. Mr. Foster's health continued to slip. My grandmother would go next door every day, sitting with him, reading to him, or just talking about anything and everything to keep his mind off his sickness. Mrs. Foster would always be nearby, bustling around in the kitchen, but there was a quiet sadness that seemed to hang in the air. No one said it outright, but everyone knew Mr. Foster's time was running out. Then one morning, my grandmother was sitting on the front porch of her house. The sun was shining brightly, and the air smelled of fresh grass and salt water. She was playing with her doll, humming a song her mother had taught her, when she looked up and saw Mr. Foster walking down the street in front of their house. She froze for a second, squinting in the morning light. It was him, all right, his familiar gait, the cap on his head, his slow and steady steps. He didn't look like he was struggling. He looked fine, healthier than he had in weeks. My grandmother watched him for a moment as he walked past her house, tipped his cap, and continued on his way. It wasn't uncommon for Mr. Foster to take walks, even when he was sick, but there was something about this moment that felt different. She thought to herself how good it was to see him out and about again, how it looked like he was finally getting better. After a while, the excitement of seeing him outside wore off, and she got up to go next door. She wanted to tell Mrs. Foster that her husband was up and about, that he was taking walks again, and that everything was going to be okay. It wasn't until she knocked on the door that she realized something was wrong. Mrs. Foster opened the door, her face pale and tired. My grandmother told her about seeing Mr. Foster walking by earlier that morning, how happy she was to see him looking so well. But instead of the relief she expected, she saw a look of confusion on Mrs. Foster's face. "Mrs. Foster, I saw him walking just a little while ago," my grandmother said. "I was so happy to see him out of the house, looking better." Mrs. Foster's face grew even more serious. She stepped back from the door, her hand trembling as she clutched the doorknob. "Honey, Mr. Foster passed away early this morning," she said quietly. My grandmother didn't know what to say. She felt a strange chill wash over her, like the ground had just shifted beneath her. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Mrs. Foster went on to explain how Mr. Foster had slipped away in his sleep that morning, peacefully. But still, it was hard to believe. My grandmother just stood there for a moment, not knowing what to make of it. She didn't mention the walk she had seen. It didn't seem possible. How could Mr. Foster have walked by her house when he was already gone? And yet, in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had really seen him. As time went on, my grandmother would sometimes sit on the porch, thinking about that moment. She'd wonder what it all meant. Was it a sign, a dream, or maybe just a trick of the mind? She never found the answer, but the story stayed with her, as it stayed with me when she told it to me. I used to think about it a lot as a kid. What if there really was something after this life? What if the people we loved didn't just disappear? That thought gave me comfort in a way. I could imagine a time, maybe far in the future, when I'd see my loved ones again. I thought about how my grandmother must have felt, standing there on the porch, watching Mr. Foster walk by, even after he was gone. It made the world seem a little bit bigger, a little bit more mysterious. It wasn't a scary thought, but one that made me feel less alone. Looking back, I realize now that my grandmother never sought to make it seem like anything supernatural had happened. She didn't say it was a ghost or some kind of haunting. It was just a thing that happened, something she didn't quite understand but had to live with. And in a way, that's what makes the story so powerful. It wasn't about what came after. It was about the simple truth of life, how it keeps moving forward, even when things don't make sense. The Foster's house was eventually sold, and the new owners tore it down to build something bigger. Nantucket changed, as it always does. The island became more crowded, and things that had once been familiar and comforting slowly faded away. But that story, the one my grandmother told me all those years ago, stayed with me. It reminded me that the world can hold surprises, things we can't explain, and that sometimes, even in the quietest moments, life finds a way to make itself known. I like to think that maybe Mr. Foster's walk that morning wasn't a fluke. Maybe it was a way of saying goodbye, or maybe it was just one of those things that happened for no reason at all. But either way, it left me with something I still carry today. A little piece of hope, a belief that even when we can't see it, there's always something beyond what we understand.